Explosions thunder across the coast of Normandy as thousands of Allied ships unleash the largest amphibious invasion in history. Waves of soldiers storm the beaches under relentless fire, while the fate of the world hangs in the balance. And on this single day in June 1944, courage, sacrifice, and strategy collide to begin the liberation of Europe. Welcome to the entire story of D-Day, the turning point of the Second World War, where we will trace the secret planning, the desperate defenses of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the paratroopers dropped into darkness, the chaos of Omaha Beach, and the monumental cost paid in blood and bravery. So sit back, close your eyes, and let this detailed documentary guide you through every moment of Operation Overlord as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there. It helps us connect with history together across the world. It was the summer of 1944. Yet the tempest had been gathering for years, long before any boots touched the beaches, before paratroopers leaped into the night, before a single landing craft entered the water. The battle for Normandy had already commenced. It began not with explosives or gunfire, but with whispers, with lies disguised as intelligence, with covert movements behind enemy lines, and with a deception so intricate and precise that it fooled Hitler himself. The stakes were incredibly high. If the plan were to fail, if the Germans were to learn the truth, then D-Day would culminate not in liberation, but in a massacre. Fast forward to June. Eisenhower is in a room, his hands clasped behind his back, intently studying a weather map. Outside, the largest invasion fleet in history is waiting off the English coast, more than 150,000 soldiers, over 5,000 vessels, and nearly 11,000 aircraft. But the storm is relentless. Time is slipping away. If he issues the command too early, he will be sending thousands to their doom. But how did the situation reach this point? Let's return to the secret war, the unseen conflict that started years before the Allies had even decided on a landing site. By 1943, the Nazi control over Europe was firm. They called it Fortress Europe. Hitler had fortified the western coastline with concrete and steel, creating a network of bunkers, artillery, and machine gun positions. His generals knew an invasion was inevitable, but they were unsure of where it would strike. This uncertainty gave the Allies a single advantage, the element of surprise. But surprise is not a matter of chance. It must be carefully constructed, one falsehood at a time. So they started to build a web of deception, one so believable and detailed that it would convince even the most suspicious minds of what they were meant to believe. The operation was named Bodyguard. Its objective was to persuade the Germans that the main invasion would occur at a different location. While Normandy was the true target, the narrative fed to the Nazis was that the Allies would land at the Pas de Calais, the shortest distance between Britain and France. It was a logical choice, almost too logical. That was the deception. To make the lie credible, they fabricated an entire army, the 1st US Army Group. It was a phantom force, but on paper, on the radio, and in aerial reconnaissance photos it appeared very real. This part of the operation was called Fortitude. Inflatable tanks were positioned in open fields, wooden aircraft were placed on fake airfields, and canvas-covered trucks drove in circles to simulate activity. Fictitious radio traffic was broadcast day and night, all of it intercepted by German intelligence. At the center of this ruse was a ghost, General George S. Patton. The Germans held him in high regard, fearing his military prowess, and believing that if anyone were to lead the invasion, it would be him. The Allies capitalized on this belief, placing him in command of the fictitious army, positioned directly across the channel from Calais. The Nazis fell for it. But props and rumours alone were not sufficient. They needed intelligence from within the German military establishment, and they had it. Double agents, spies who fed the Germans carefully crafted misinformation, were instrumental. One such agent was a Spanish double agent codenamed Garbo. To the Germans he was a trusted asset with an extensive network. To the British he was the key to shaping the narrative. His perfectly timed false reports detailed troop movements, supply lines and invasion strategies, all pointing towards Calais. The Germans trusted him without question. But this deception was more than just a psychological game. It was a high-stakes chess match, played in the shadows. A single mistake, a single flaw in the story, and the entire plan would unravel. The Allies monitored everything, from the speed of German troop movements to the frequency of their radio signals. They watched, they waited, and they adapted the lie as necessary. They even orchestrated a fake invasion of Norway, Operation Sky, to add another layer of confusion, another illusion to the mix. Meanwhile, real intelligence agencies worked tirelessly to protect the truth. Cryptographers at Bletchley Park, the men and women who deciphered Nazi codes, ensured that no real secrets were leaked. The Ultra program, as it was known, gave the Allies direct access to German communications, serving as both a lifeline and a shield. But the risk was ever present. At any moment, the enemy could connect the dots. At any moment, the truth could be revealed. So they continued to adapt, to adjust, to repeat the same lie until even the enemy started to believe it. But for all the secrecy and strategy, there was one factor they could not control: the weather. By early June, the invasion force was in position. Soldiers had been briefed, aircraft were loaded, and ships were waiting in the harbours of southern England. But the skies turned dark, the winds picked up, the waves grew, and Eisenhower, the man in charge, had to make a critical decision: launch the invasion in a storm, or wait and risk losing everything. A delay could mean losing the right tide, the right moon, and the element of surprise. But moving too soon could mean men drowning before they even reached the shore. In a quiet meeting room, Eisenhower sat with his commanders. The air was tense, everyone watching him. He reviewed the reports, checked the clock, and looked out the window. Then, with a calm that seemed to come from nowhere, he spoke 2 words: "We'll go." And just like that, the fate of the war was decided. But in Berlin, the Nazis still believed the main attack would be at Calais. Even days after the landings began, Hitler refused to divert reinforcements to Normandy. He was convinced it was a feint, a diversion. That was the power of Operation Bodyguard. A web of lies so convincing that even when faced with the truth, under fire, with beaches being taken and paratroopers in the fields, the enemy held back, waiting for an attack that would never materialize. This bought the Allies precious time, just enough time to secure the beaches, to breach the wall, to begin the liberation of France. But that time came at a great cost, because while the deception was successful, the beaches still ran with blood, and the men who landed there had no idea if the plan had worked. They only knew that the bullets were real, the bodies were real, the screams were real, and they continued to move forward anyway, because in war, you don't need to know the entire plan. You just need to take the next step, even if it's into the unknown. The whisper had grown into a storm, and now it was time to make landfall. But what happened next, what those men witnessed when the ramps lowered, would determine the fate of a continent, and not all of them would survive it. The beach was ablaze. Machine guns sent a constant stream of bullets, like a downpour. Mortars shrieked from the cliffs above. Smoke drifted over the waves, a dark curtain obscuring the morning light. Men crawled, ran, and fell. Some didn't even make it out of the boats. A young soldier, perhaps 19 or 20, jumped into the water, which filled his helmet, his heart pounding in his chest. He was deafened by the noise, not the orders, not the screams, not even his own cries, just the deafening sound of war. As he struggled through the sand, he wondered, why here? Why this particular beach? Why Normandy? The answer to that question had been formulated over years. By the end of 1943, the Allies were certain of one thing. The war could not be won until they broke through Hitler's Western defenses. Fortress Europe, as the Nazis called it, was a formidable barrier stretching from Norway to the southern coast of France, a line of bunkers, barbed wire, and steel obstacles resembling a shark's jaw. Breaching it would be a monumental task. The question was where to strike. Many thought the logical choice was the Pas-de Calais. It was the narrowest point between Britain and France, just over 20 miles. It offered the shortest distance, the quickest route, ideal for aircraft and ships. It was too direct. That was the issue. The Germans anticipated an attack there and had built their strongest defenses. The artillery was heavier, the troop concentrations were greater. The Atlantic Wall was nearly impregnable at Calais. So the planners looked further south on the map, to Normandy, a quiet region of rolling hills, dairy farms, and apple orchards. Nothing about it suggested it would be the gateway to the downfall of Nazi Germany. But that was precisely what made it the perfect choice. It wasn't an ideal landing site. The beaches were wide and exposed, leaving soldiers vulnerable. The tides were extreme, the cliffs were high, and there were no major ports nearby. But it had one crucial advantage: surprise. And in war, surprise is paramount. The decision was made not on a whim or a guess, but after hundreds of hours of planning, debate, and calculation. Top British and American generals sat at long tables with maps spread out like quilts across their desks. Colored pins indicated enemy positions, red strings marked flight paths, and charts detailed tides and weather patterns. Every possibility was considered, every risk assessed. Normandy would be the point of attack. The plan involved 5 beachheads along a 50-mile stretch of coastline, each with its own codename: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Each beach had its own unique terrain, its own set of dangers, its own story. Utah, on the western flank, was assigned to the Americans. It was characterized by marshes and causeways, meaning troops would have to fight through flooded fields and along narrow roads. Omaha, perhaps the most notorious, was a death trap. High bluffs, open sands, and heavily fortified German positions made it the most dangerous beach of all. Gold and Sword were assigned to the British. Their objective was to capture key towns and link up with other forces before German reinforcements could arrive. Juno was given to the Canadians, who were eager to prove their mettle after years of being underestimated. But selecting the beaches was just the first step. The real challenge was getting the men there. The English Channel in June is a treacherous body of water, cold, rough, with strong tides and full of mines. Naval planners had to move thousands of ships, from massive battleships to small landing craft, across those waters without alerting the enemy. They conducted endless rehearsals. Entire villages in England were evacuated so that soldiers could practice storming mock beaches. There were accidents, boats capsized, weapons jammed, and lives were lost even in training, but they persisted. The Air Force also had to prepare. Paratroopers would be dropped behind enemy lines hours before the beach landings, in the dark, into unfamiliar territory, often under heavy fire. It would be the largest airborne assault in history. But even the best laid plans are worthless without the right timing, and timing depended on something no general could control: the moon. They needed a full moon to guide the paratroopers, a low tide to expose the beach obstacles, and a rising tide so that the landing craft wouldn't get stranded. This combination of a full moon, low tide, and early morning light only occurred on a few days in June. The date was set June 6, 1944. But Normandy wasn't chosen solely for military reasons. It was also chosen for moral ones. France had been under German occupation for 4 years. Its people, once free and proud, were living in fear, under curfews, under the boot of Nazi rule. Every French village, every cobblestone street, every farmhouse hiding a resistance fighter was waiting for this moment. Normandy became the gateway to freedom. But that freedom would come at a steep price. The Germans, though taken by surprise, were well entrenched. They had concrete bunkers, machine guns with overlapping fields of fire, and mortars pre-aimed at the beach approaches. They had planted mines in the sand and hidden underwater obstacles in the surf. They had snipers in the hills, artillery on the cliffs, and years of planning invested in every inch of the coastline. Rommel, the desert fox, had been tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall. He believed the only way to defeat an invasion was to destroy it before it could establish a foothold. He ordered steel beams to be driven into the beaches, angled to tear open the hulls of incoming boats. Mines were attached to logs, and traps were hidden in the dunes. Barbed wire stretched for miles. Rommel wanted the sea to be red with blood before the first boot touched the shore. But Rommel didn't know when or where the attack would come. That was the crucial element. And that was why Normandy was chosen, because while the enemy was focused on Calais, the real storm was brewing far to the west. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't a safe plan, but it was a bold one. It was the culmination of everything the Allies had worked for, and when the time came, there would be no turning back. The men who would land in Normandy were not just soldiers. They were farm boys, factory workers, and college students. Some were veterans of previous campaigns, while others had never seen combat. They carried rifles, letters from home, and the weight of the free world on their shoulders. They had trained for months, sometimes years, for this single day. Some wrote letters the night before, sealing them and leaving them with chaplains, just in case. Some laughed nervously, some were silent. Others stared out at the dark waves, whispering prayers, clutching keepsakes, and thinking of their mothers, their wives, their children. They didn't know if they would see the next sunrise. They only knew that when the ramp dropped, they had to run. And so the decision to attack at Normandy was not just a strategic one. It was a choice made with both heart and mind, not just with maps and calculations. It was a decision to risk everything for a chance to open the gates of Europe. The generals knew what was waiting for them. They knew the cost, but they also knew this: if they could break through at Normandy, the path to Paris would be open. If they failed, it would be another generation before freedom had another chance. The clock was ticking, the troops were loaded, and the skies were starting to clear. The beaches of Normandy waited in silence, and in the next chapter, that silence would be broken. The clock was ticking. Outside, the sea was rough, with waves crashing against the hulls of the waiting ships. Inside a quiet room deep in southern England, a man sat alone, his face cast in shadow by the dim light of a single lamp. His eyes, heavy from sleepless nights, scanned the flood of reports, weather charts, and maps spread out before him. The fate of the free world was in his hands. Dwight D. Eisenhower was about to make the single most important decision of the Second World War. The invasion was ready to launch. Over 150,000 soldiers were poised to storm the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of ships, tanks, and aircraft had been assembled into the largest armada in human history. The Allied forces were gathered, trained, and prepared. But the weather was turning, the tides were unpredictable, and the element of surprise was fragile. If Eisenhower gave the order, thousands would die. The weight of that knowledge was immense. This was not just a military operation, it was a gamble with countless lives, with history itself hanging in the balance. In the early hours of June 5, 1944, Eisenhower wrestled with a storm within himself as fierce as the one raging outside. The invasion was scheduled to begin on the 5th, but the weather had forced a postponement. The forecast showed a brief window of opportunity, just one day, with calmer seas, low tides, and enough moonlight for the airborne troops to land. If they waited, that window might close, and the weather could worsen again. If that happened, the invasion could be delayed for weeks, giving the Germans time to reinforce their defenses and losing the precious advantage of surprise. Yet, if they moved too soon, the rough seas could drown soldiers before they even reached the shore. Landing craft could be lost, aircraft could be wrecked, and the entire invasion could end in a bloodbath. Eisenhower sat at his desk, alone with his thoughts and the flickering lamp. He knew that the decision he made in the next few hours would change the world forever. And yet, no plan, no strategy, no map could fully predict the chaos that lay ahead. The room was silent except for the scratching of a pen and the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the tension was almost unbearable. He summoned his closest advisors. Weather experts, commanders and intelligence officers gathered around him, their faces grim but determined. They debated, they argued, they presented their best data, their most honest opinions, but in the end, the choice was Eisenhower's alone. One of the weather forecasters spoke softly. "The storm is moving away. There will be a brief break on the 6th. It may be the only chance." Another officer warned, "If we wait for a better forecast, we lose the moonlight. Paratroopers will be blind. Landing craft may get stuck." Eisenhower weighed their words, feeling the pressure of every life that depended on his command. For months, the Allied forces had been preparing. Soldiers had trained relentlessly, paratroopers had rehearsed their jumps, and naval crews had practiced landing operations. The entire operation, code-named Overlord, was a symphony of coordination, timing, and trust. But now, in this moment of quiet before the storm, it all came down to one man's judgment. Eisenhower had not slept well. He thought of the men he had met, the young faces filled with both hope and fear, the letters they carried from home, the families they had left behind. He thought of his own family, his wife waiting in the States. The burden of command was heavy and lonely. He reached for a piece of paper and wrote a brief statement. "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops." It was a message prepared for failure, a message he hoped he would never have to send. But he had to be ready. He folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. The hours passed like a slow tide. Every sound, every knock at the door, seemed amplified in the stillness. Finally, the call came with the latest reports from the weather stations. The storm was easing, the tide charts aligned, and the moon would shine just enough. Eisenhower stood and walked to the window. Outside, the fleet waited in silence, an army poised to cross into history. He took a deep breath and with steady hands signed the order to proceed with the invasion on June 6, 1944. A wave of relief washed over the room, but there was no celebration, not yet. Because the gamble was supreme. The world's greatest invasion was about to begin. The weight of command did not lift from Eisenhower's shoulders. He knew that countless lives would be lost, that history would remember this day, but not the faces behind the decision. As dawn approached, he prepared to broadcast a message to the troops, a simple message: good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Those words would echo through the ages. But what Eisenhower could not know was how the men would face the horrors ahead, how the beaches would run red with blood, how some would never hear the blessing, and how the gamble would ripple through history, forever changing the course of the war. The invasion had begun, and there was no turning back. What awaited those soldiers as they stormed the shores? Would the gamble pay off, or would it crumble in disaster? The world held its breath. The beach was a crucible of chaos and courage. The morning light barely penetrated the haze of smoke and dust, yet the air was thick with both fear and resolve. Men stumbled, crawled, and ran, some shouting orders, others silent with pain or terror. Machine guns rattled, artillery boomed, and the salty seawater soaked the sand, which now ran red. Amidst the noise and fury, one soldier looked around, searching for the face of a friend, a lifeline in the madness. Who were these men? Who were the souls who answered the call, who left everything behind to storm the beaches of Normandy on that historic day? They were not born heroes. They were ordinary men shaped by extraordinary times. Across the Allied nations, young men from quiet farms in the Midwest to bustling factories in England had been gathered, trained, and transformed. Some were barely out of their teens. Some had scraped through years of economic hardship to find purpose in the fight, and others had already fought in distant campaigns, hardened by battle, but still filled with the same raw mix of hope and fear. Each had a story. Private James Miller was a mechanic from Ohio. He had never fired a weapon before enlisting, but learned quickly, driven by a fierce desire to protect his younger brother back home. Corporal Thomas Jenkins, a coal miner from Wales, carried a photograph of his wife tucked inside his jacket, a reminder of what awaited him if he survived. Lieutenant Pierre Moreau, a French-Canadian, had left his family in Quebec to join the fight to free his ancestral homeland. They came from different places and spoke with different accents, but they shared a common bond, the unbreakable brotherhood of soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. Before the landing craft pushed off, these men were tested in the most grueling ways imaginable. Their training was relentless, a transformation of both body and mind. Soldiers woke before dawn to endless drills, marching, shooting, bayonet practice, amphibious landings, and obstacle courses designed to break their bodies and forge their spirits. Imagine the cold mud seeping into every crack, the rain soaking through uniforms, the aching muscles that screamed for rest but never got it. Imagine the frustration of repeated failures, the missed shots, the tangled ropes, the capsized boats. They were pushed to their limits, because war does not forgive weakness. Yet, it wasn't just about muscle and endurance. It was about trust. Trust in leaders, trust in equipment, trust in the man beside you who might have to drag you from the rubble or cover your retreat. Many soldiers formed bonds that would last a lifetime. Those bonds were lifelines, shields against fear and loneliness. Fear was a constant shadow, a stone in the belly that twisted nerves and quickened breath. But it was a fear born not of cowardice, but of respect for the dangers ahead. Some men talked of it openly, while others tucked it deep inside where no one could see. Many wrote letters home the night before, sealing them carefully, as if preparing for the worst. Others whispered quiet prayers, clutching keepsakes, lockets, letters, photos, small talismans against the storm of war. Private Miller kept a worn Bible in his breast pocket. Lieutenant Moreau had a lucky coin given to him by his mother. They shared jokes in the dim light of their barracks, their laughter fragile but fierce, fighting back the darkness with moments of light. And when the call finally came, they moved together like brothers, stepping into the fire. The invasion force was a patchwork of different units and nationalities, American, British, Canadian, each bringing their own traditions and experiences. Yet the chaos of battle quickly erased those lines. Survival demanded cooperation, and success demanded unity. On Omaha Beach, for example, American soldiers faced brutal machine gun fire from well-fortified German bunkers. Many men were cut down before even reaching the sand. But through sheer grit and the determination to protect one another, the survivors pushed forward. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops had to fight through barbed wire, mines, and sniper fire. They moved as a unit, covering each other as they advanced. At Gold and Sword Beaches, British forces fought street by street to take towns and secure bridges. Every man understood something simple. The soldier beside you is the difference between life and death. One famous story is of the Great Escape by a small group of paratroopers who, despite being scattered and outnumbered, gathered to fight a fierce German counterattack. Their courage and cooperation bought crucial hours for the main invasion to succeed, but the battle was not won by strategy alone. It was won by the blood, sweat, and unyielding spirit of the men on the ground. Many would fall that day, some lost in the surf, some behind enemy lines, others in the muddy fields of Normandy. Their names are etched in history, but their faces, smiling, scared, determined, remain with the stories told by their comrades. Through letters, diaries, and memories, their voices speak across time. I was terrified, but I kept going because my friend was beside me. We shared everything from rations to hope. The moments of laughter before the storm kept us human. These brothers in arms did not choose the war, but they chose to face it together. Their friendship was more than camaraderie. It was the lifeline that made the impossible possible. And as the invasion pushed forward, that bond was tested again and again. Would their courage hold? Would their unity be enough? The beaches had been taken, but the road to liberation was long, bloody, and uncertain. And the men who fought that day carried the hopes of a world yearning to be free. Theirs was a story of fear, of friendship, and of a courage that would echo through history. What came next would show the true meaning of brotherhood in the face of war. And the battle for Normandy had only just begun. Darkness enveloped the sky like a shroud. The roar of engines filled the cramped fuselages of the transport planes, humming through the night as they sliced silently over the English Channel. Below, the French countryside lay asleep, unaware of the storm about to descend upon it. Inside the planes, men gripped their rifles and parachutes with sweaty hands, their hearts pounding louder than the engines. Their breaths came fast and shallow, but their faces were set. They had trained for this moment, dreamed of it, and feared it. They were the paratroopers, thousands of soldiers ordered to leap into the unknown, deep behind enemy lines in the dead of night. But this was no ordinary night jump. It was the opening act of the greatest invasion in history. The mission was simple in words, but almost impossible in practice. Drop scattered forces across Normandy to seize bridges, disrupt communications, and throw German defenses into chaos. The goal was to carve openings for the massive beach landings that would follow at dawn. Yet the night quickly turned into a nightmare. As the planes crossed the coast, German anti-aircraft guns, known as flak, opened fire, their deadly bursts lighting up the sky like fireworks. Bullets tore into the metal fuselages, sending sparks and smoke. Some planes were hit and went down, their crews fighting to keep control. Then the darkness played its cruelest trick. Thick clouds and fog blanketed the landing zones. Navigation instruments were unreliable, and radio signals were jammed. Pilots struggled to find their drop points. Soldiers prepared to jump, not knowing where they would land. The order came, jump. One by one, men plunged into the black abyss. But the chaos meant many were dropped miles from their intended targets. Groups were scattered across fields, forests, and villages. Many landed tangled in trees or caught on barbed wire. Lieutenant John Steele, for example, found himself hooked on the spire of a church in the small village of Sainte-Mère-Église, swinging helplessly as German soldiers below aimed their rifles at him. He hung there for hours, wounded but alive, becoming one of the war's most iconic stories. Others weren't so fortunate. Men fell into flooded fields, sinking into cold water, fighting to free themselves as bullets whipped overhead. Others landed in open fields where German patrols waited, their lives ending before the battle even began. With units broken and communications shattered, small groups of soldiers had to improvise. Strangers became brothers as they gathered weapons, planned attacks, and set out to complete their missions. Imagine the fear. Strangers alone in enemy territory, unsure who to trust, deafened by gunfire and the crackling of nearby explosions. Every sound could mean death. But amid the fear, courage shone through. Corporal James Hill, separated from his platoon, led a ragtag group of paratroopers on a daring assault to secure a vital bridge over the Mulberry River. Their success was crucial in preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. At the same time, gliders carrying troops crashed in fields near Pegasus Bridge, their crews rushing out to capture the crossing just minutes after the first drops. These actions behind enemy lines were vital threads woven into the larger tapestry of the invasion. Yet the night was long, cold, and merciless. Soldiers battled exhaustion, injuries, and the gnawing fear that help might never come. For many, it was the longest night of their lives. As dawn approached, scattered paratroopers began to regroup. Their presence sowed confusion among German commanders, who struggled to understand the scale and location of the invasion. The airborne assault had done its job, disrupting enemy lines, seizing key points, and buying precious time for the forces storming the beaches. But the price was high. Thousands of men were lost or missing in those first hours. Yet their sacrifice paved the way for the success of D-Day. As the sun rose over Normandy, the battle for Europe had truly begun, and the stories of those paratroopers, their bravery, their fear, their brotherhood, would echo through history forever. What awaited them next was a brutal fight to hold the ground they had seized. The paratroopers' longest night had ended, but their war had just begun. A single sentence shattered the quiet of countless living rooms, cafes, and farms across occupied France. The dice are on the carpet. To most it was just a curious phrase, a fleeting line in a foreign radio broadcast. But to those who waited in the shadows, their hearts pounding, it was a signal that the long-awaited moment had arrived. The invasion was underway. For years the French resistance had lived in silence, hiding in plain sight beneath the ever-watchful eyes of Nazi occupiers. They were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, young men and women who had taken on impossible risks, smuggling messages, sabotaging railways, and gathering intelligence, all while pretending to live ordinary lives. Their world was one of secret signs, hidden codes, and whispered messages. The BBC broadcast from London were their lifeline, a mix of news, weather reports, and most importantly, coded phrases slipped in among songs and stories, words meant only for them, to guide their actions and keep hope alive. On the night of June 5, 1944, the resistance listened intently to the broadcast. "The dice are on the carpet." That phrase was more than words. It was a call to arms. Across the countryside, men and women sprang into action. Saboteurs slipped into the dark to sever telephone wires, derail trains, and block roads. Resistance cells coordinated attacks to slow German troop movements, striking at supply lines and communication hubs. The goal was clear: disrupt the enemy's ability to respond to the invasion, buying precious time for the Allied forces storming the beaches. The risks were enormous. A single mistake could mean capture, torture, and death. But for these fighters, freedom was worth every danger. Take the story of Marie Dubos, a school teacher in Normandy. By day, she taught children the alphabet. By night, she delivered messages, hid weapons, and warned local villagers of impending German patrols. When the code words came, she gathered her small group, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. "Tonight we strike." They moved silently through the village, cutting wires and burning bridges. The explosions echoed like thunder, a reminder that liberation was close, but so was danger. Elsewhere, a young man named Jacques Morel, barely 20, joined his comrades to attack a German supply train. The rails were sabotaged, the train derailed, and the enemy was forced to reroute troops, delays that might save lives on the beaches. The resistance was not just a force of sabotage, it was a symbol of hope, a message that the French people had not given up. And their courage inspired the Allies, who knew that victory would require not just soldiers but a united front behind enemy lines. Yet the German occupiers were ruthless. They hunted the resistance with brutal efficiency, using informants, raids, and executions to crush dissent. Every act of defiance was a gamble with life. But the code words had been spoken, and the resistance moved as one. As the invasion unfolded, their efforts multiplied, weaving chaos into the German war machine. Railways were cut, communications were shattered, and roads were blocked. The Allies found a nation ready to rise with them. But the fight was far from over. Would the resistance hold under the brutal German counterattacks? Would their sacrifices tip the balance in the struggle for Europe? The code words were just the beginning, and as the battle for Normandy raged, the eyes of the world turned to these unsung heroes, fighters in the shadows, bound by courage and hope. Their story was about to unfold. What happened next would test their resolve and change the course of history. The first light of dawn had not yet broken, but the air was thick with tension. The sea stretched endlessly, grey and restless beneath a leaden sky. From horizon to horizon, the Allied armada, over 7,000 ships, landing craft, and support vessels, quietly moved toward the beaches of Normandy. Inside the landing craft, the men sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear, determination, and the heavy weight of what lay ahead. Some whispered prayers, clutching letters from home. Others stared silently into the churning waves, trying to steady their nerves. For months, they had trained for this moment, countless hours spent learning how to land under fire, how to move forward against entrenched enemies, how to survive the unimaginable. But no training could erase the reality of what awaited. At precisely 6:30 a.m., H hour, the order was given. The ramps dropped, and a tide of men surged forward into hell. The beaches erupted in a symphony of destruction, the thunder of artillery, the staccato of machine guns, the screams of men, and the roar of explosions. On Omaha Beach, the deadliest and most fiercely contested of all, the nightmare began immediately. Men were cut down before they could even touch the sand. The sea seemed to claim as many as the enemy, Waves crashed over the struggling soldiers, many weighed down by heavy packs and weapons, dragged beneath by the cold, merciless water. Barbed wire stretched across the beach, and wooden stakes and metal hedgehogs were scattered to stop landing craft and slow advancing troops. Corpses blocked paths, while others lay writhing wounded, pleading for help. Amid this chaos was Private Robert Jenkins, a 20-year-old from Nebraska. His boots were sucked into the mud, his rifle jammed, and bullets tore past his helmet. Around him, friends fell, some crying out, others silent forever. But Robert pressed on, a single thought pounding in his mind. Keep moving forward. Further up the beach, machine gun nests in concrete bunkers spat death with cruel precision. German gunners calmly tracked their targets, firing until their magazines were empty before reloading to kill again. Men crawled, ran, and leaped over obstacles, often dragging their comrades with them. Medics rushed through the carnage, risking their own lives to patch wounds with trembling hands. On Utah Beach, the scene was no less fierce but somewhat less deadly. American forces faced formidable defenses, but the terrain and some fortunate errors in German placement meant fewer casualties. Yet every inch gained was hard-won through courage and sacrifice. To the east, Canadian troops at Juno Beach confronted minefields, barbed wire, and machine gun fire. Their advance was relentless, with soldiers clearing bunkers, fighting house to house, and breaking through enemy lines. British forces at Gold and Sword Beaches fought fiercely as well, securing towns and pushing inland to meet airborne forces dropped earlier behind enemy lines. The vast network of German defences, the Atlantic Wall, was a fortress in its own right. Concrete bunkers housed artillery and machine guns, observation posts scanned the horizon, and minefields and obstacles awaited every advancing soldier. The Germans had spent years preparing for this moment, building defences that were supposed to make any invasion impossible. Yet the bravery of the Allied soldiers shattered those walls. Corporal John Miller, part of the famed 2nd Ranger Battalion, famously volunteered to storm a heavily defended bunker alone. Under relentless fire, he crawled across open ground and threw grenades into the enemy position, silencing the guns and inspiring his comrades to follow. Such acts of individual courage were multiplied thousands of times that day. Every platoon, every squad, every soldier played a role in breaking the German hold. But the cost was staggering. Thousands of men were killed, wounded, or missing within the first hours. Many families would never receive the letters they had hoped for. Yet, despite the blood and chaos, a foothold was gained. The beaches, soaked in sacrifice, became the gateway for millions of soldiers, tanks, and supplies to pour into France. Behind that fragile line lay the hedgerows of Normandy, thick, tangled walls of earth and bushes that would become the next deadly battleground. The question was clear. Would these men, many barely able to stand, have the strength to push forward? Would their sacrifice be enough to turn the tide of war? The guns continued to roar, the battle raged on, and the world watched, holding its breath. The story of D-Day was not just a story of strategy and plans. It was a story of men who faced unimaginable terror and refused to yield. Their courage would echo through history, a testament to the price of freedom. But the war was far from over. The fight for Europe had truly begun, and in the smoke and blood of that hellish dawn, the future was forged. The sky was a cold grey canvas stretched over the cliffs of Normandy. Below, the sea churned in restless waves, swollen by the early morning wind. The landing craft cut through the surf, their engines roaring, packed with young men who barely knew what awaited them. They called it Omaha, the slaughter beach. It was the deadliest and most brutal landing of D-Day. Men fell before they even reached the shore, swept away by waves or ripped apart by relentless German fire. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the sharp crack of gunfire. Bodies piled up on the blood-soaked sand, tangled in barbed wire and broken stakes. It seemed the invasion might fail before it even began. Why did Omaha nearly collapse? And how did those who survived find the strength to push through? The story begins with a grim miscalculation, weather, tides, and German defenses that were stronger than expected. The preliminary bombardment, meant to soften the enemy, was uneven and failed to destroy key fortifications. German soldiers, well trained and deeply dug into concrete bunkers atop the bluffs, waited calmly as the landing craft approached. Their machine guns and artillery were aimed precisely to mow down the waves of soldiers below. The chaos was immediate and overwhelming. Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor described it as a meat grinder. Men struggled to leave their craft, only to be met with a deadly hailstorm of bullets. Many drowned in the surf, weighed down by heavy packs and weapons, dragged beneath the waves by currents and exhaustion. The obstacles on the beach, wooden stakes, barbed wire, and mines, were designed to trap and kill. Soldiers crawled through the sand, desperate to find cover, but nowhere was safe. Amid the carnage, a small group of men found themselves trapped in a draw, a small gully leading off the beach. Cut off from the rest, their only way forward was up the steep bluffs, under constant fire. One of those men was Sergeant Bill Taylor, a farm boy from Nebraska. He later recalled the fear, the noise, the smell of smoke and blood, but also the fierce determination to survive and protect the men beside him. Against all odds, the men in the draw began to climb. Using ropes, ladders, and even their bare hands, they scaled the cliffs. They took out machine gun nests with grenades, one by one, clearing a path for others. Their courage sparked a chain reaction. Soldiers who had been pinned down began to regroup and move inland. Officers and non-commissioned officers stepped up, improvising plans when communication broke down. Small units, often strangers before the landing, fought side by side, united by a desperate will to live and win. Corporal John Steele, remembered for being caught on the church steeple at Sainte-Mère-Église, was among these men who faced near impossible odds with unbreakable spirit. Their bravery slowly turned the tide, but the cost was staggering. By the end of the day, nearly 2,000 American soldiers lay dead on Omaha's shores. Thousands more were wounded or missing. Families across the world received news of loss and heartbreak. Yet, the foothold at Omaha was crucial. It allowed reinforcements, vehicles, and supplies to pour in. It became a gateway for the liberation of France. The lessons learned that day shaped the tactics and courage of Allied forces for the battles ahead. Omaha was a slaughterhouse, but also a symbol of resilience. The question remained, would the men who survived have the strength to carry the fight further inland? Would the sacrifice at Omaha be enough to break the German hold on Western Europe? The answer lay just beyond the bluffs, in the fields and towns that awaited liberation. And the story of Omaha was far from over. The battle for Normandy had only just begun. The early morning sky was a muted grey, the horizon barely visible through a thick veil of mist rolling off the English Channel. Below, the waters were restless, churning and cold, as waves slapped against the hulls of the hundreds of landing craft making their way toward the shores of Normandy. Among them were the men of the 7th U.S. Army, assigned the daunting task of securing Utah Beach, the westernmost landing site of the D-Day invasion. They were a mix of seasoned soldiers and fresh-faced volunteers, all bound by a shared sense of duty and the weight of the moment. Maps had been studied, plans drawn with meticulous care. Every man knew his role, every officer his responsibility, Yet even the best-laid plans are fragile under the chaos of war. As the landing craft neared their designated point, a powerful current pushed them nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. It was a mistake, a navigational error, one that could have spelled disaster. Instead, it became a stroke of fortune. Utah Beach, though less fortified than Omaha, was no walk in the park. The defenses were lighter, the German troops fewer, but the terrain was deceptive, marked by flooded fields, marshes, and deadly obstacles hidden beneath murky waters. When the ramps dropped at precisely 6:30 in the morning, the men waded into cold, knee-deep water, their boots sinking into thick sand and mud. Some slipped and fell, their weapons dragging beneath them, but they pushed forward, driven by years of preparation and the urgent call to liberate their allies. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former president, immediately assessed the situation. Instead of panicking or trying to correct their course, he accepted their position with quiet resolve. "We'll start the war from right here," he declared to his men. His voice calm but filled with determination. That leadership was crucial. In moments like these, plans become irrelevant. What matters is action, swift, decisive, and flexible. Small units formed spontaneously, officers and enlisted men improvising to meet the situation. They moved inland, seizing vital bridges and road junctions, cutting off German reinforcements. The fighting was fierce, though less deadly than at Omaha. The Germans, caught off guard by the unexpected landing zone, scrambled to regroup. Yet they were well trained, and their counterattacks were brutal and unrelenting. The terrain itself was an enemy. Flooded fields, created by the Germans as defensive measures, turned into treacherous traps. Soldiers had to wade through water up to their waists, carrying heavy packs and weapons, all while exposed to enemy fire. Barbed wire and mines lurked beneath the water's surface, claiming lives silently. Private James Porter, a medic attached to the 4th Infantry Division, later recounted the horrors of those first hours. He described pulling wounded comrades from the mud, the weight of their bodies nearly crushing him, their faces pale and their eyes glazed over. Yet, despite exhaustion and fear, the medics pressed on, their hands steady even when their hearts were not. The men of Utah Beach fought not just the enemy but nature itself. Heavy rains and low clouds, limited air support, and delayed reinforcements. Communication lines were unreliable, making coordination difficult. Yet every inch gained was hard won. The success at Utah was crucial in opening the door for thousands more soldiers, tanks, and supplies to flow onto the continent. The beachhead established there became a vital staging ground for the continued push into France. However, the cost was not negligible. Several hundred men lost their lives that day. Many more were wounded. Letters would be sent home filled with grief, and families would mourn quietly. Yet the sacrifice was not in vain. The fortunate mistake at Utah Beach underscored a powerful truth about war. Plans are only as good as the men who execute them. The courage, adaptability, and resilience of those soldiers transformed potential chaos into a decisive victory. But the battle was far from over. Behind the beaches lay the infamous Normandy Begins, the dense hedgerows and winding lanes that would slow the Allied advance to a crawl and turn the countryside into a deadly maze. The German defenders, though initially stunned, would soon regroup and launch fierce counterattacks. Would the men who survived Utah have the strength to endure the brutal battles ahead? Could the momentum gained be sustained in the face of relentless enemy resistance and unforgiving terrain? As the sun rose higher over the fields of Normandy, the answer remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: Utah Beach had been taken, the tide of war was turning, and the road to liberation had begun. Before dawn had fully broken on June 6, 1944, the skies above the Normandy coast were heavy with mist and anticipation. A vast armada of ships, 100 strong, sliced silently through the cold waters of the English Channel, carrying tens of thousands of British and Canadian soldiers. Their mission was clear, their resolve unshakable: storm the beaches codenamed Sword, Gold, and Juno, breach the seemingly impregnable Atlantic wall, and push inland to carve a path to liberation. The soldiers knew that the coming hours would test them beyond any battle they had trained for. At 6:30 in the morning, the iron gates of the landing craft slammed open, and men surged forward into a hellscape of chaos and fire. The beaches were a crucible of violence. Sword Beach, lying to the east, was the gateway to the strategic city of Caen, a prize the British desperately needed to capture to secure the eastern flank of the invasion. But the Germans were prepared. Concrete bunkers, some buried beneath earthen mounds, housed machine guns and artillery pieces, their barrels trained on the foaming surf. The beach itself was littered with obstacles designed to shred landing craft and slow the advancing troops: wooden stakes, metal hedgehogs, barbed wire, and mines. As Lieutenant James Caldwell of the Royal Norfolk Regiment hit the sands, bullets tore through the air. He described the roar as like a beast unleashed, a constant thunder that drowned out even the screams of men falling beside him. Amid the smoke and dust, men pressed forward, crawling, running, some falling only to be pulled up by their comrades. In the distance, the spires of Caen, a grim reminder of the task ahead. At Gold Beach, British forces faced equally grim challenges. The landing was hampered by stronger than expected German resistance, including hidden minefields and fortified positions that had survived the preliminary bombardment. Communication was fragmented. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the cacophony. Sergeant Margaret Harris, a signals operator with the Royal Corps of Signals, later recalled the frantic efforts to keep the lines open amid the chaos. Juno Beach, the domain of Canadian forces, was no less formidable. The Canadians faced fierce resistance from experienced German units. They fought through mined beaches, steep cliffs, and machine gun nests. Private Thomas McLeod of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada recalled the icy water biting into his bones as he waded ashore, the weight of his pack threatening to drag him under. Despite the intense fire, the Canadians advanced with grim determination, their tenacity shattering German defenses and securing a critical foothold. Each beach was a unique battle, with different terrain and different defenses, but a common story of courage and sacrifice. Behind the scenes, commanders struggled to coordinate the assault. Radios failed, messengers ran through gunfire, and the fog of war clouded every decision. Yet the soldiers adapted. Platoons formed spontaneously, leaders emerged from the smoke, and individuals took initiative. By midday, British troops at Sword had fought through the beach defences and begun pushing toward Caen, though the city's capture would prove to be a costly and prolonged struggle. Gold Beach was secured, allowing vital reinforcements, tanks, and supplies to land. At Juno, the breakthrough opened a critical corridor for the Allied advance into Normandy's interior. But the victory came at a high cost. Thousands of men were wounded or killed that day. Families around the world received grim telegrams and letters, mourning sons, brothers, and husbands lost on foreign shores. Yet, despite the losses, the beachheads held. The fierce Commonwealth storm had broken through Fortress Europe's walls. But the battle for Normandy was far from over. German forces launched counterattacks. Artillery shells rained down, and the bocage country awaited, hedgerows and narrow lanes that would turn the countryside into a deadly maze. Would the soldiers who survived Sword Gold and Juno have the strength to endure the brutal battles that lay ahead? Could the Allies maintain the momentum needed to liberate France and defeat the Nazi war machine? The answers lay beyond the beaches, in the fields, towns, and forests that had yet to be freed. As the sun set on that bloody day, one truth was clear: the Commonwealth storm had begun, and the world would never be the same. The sea was a cruel and unforgiving adversary. Storms ripped through the channel with relentless fury, waves towering like mountains, threatening to swallow ships whole. Yet, just days after the beaches of Normandy were stained with the blood of thousands, a new battle was quietly raging, not against soldiers or guns, but against nature itself. The Allies faced an enormous challenge: how to supply and sustain an army of hundreds of thousands without the use of a port. All of France's major harbours were held firmly by the Germans, fortified and mined, and the Allies could not afford the time to capture them intact. Without a functioning port, tanks, food, ammunition, fuel, everything needed to keep the invasion alive would be stranded on the beaches, vulnerable and disorganized. The entire success of the liberation hinged on a daring plan, an engineering miracle that few believed could work. The solution was unprecedented: build floating harbors, massive artificial ports that could be towed across the channel, assembled piece by piece off the Normandy coast, and provide a lifeline for the invading forces. These were the Mulberry harbors, complex, modular structures of concrete, steel, and timber designed to transform the open coastline into a bustling port. At the same time, another secret project was underway. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, an audacious attempt to deliver fuel from England to the Allied forces across the Channel through miles of underwater pipe. Both projects were feats of engineering, daring that pushed the limits of technology and human imagination. To understand the scale of this challenge, imagine building a giant port from scratch in the middle of a battlefield, with the enemy still threatening from the shore and nature fighting every step of the way. The Mulberry harbors were designed to do just that. They consisted of several key components: floating roadways called whales, massive concrete blocks known as phoenixes that acted as breakwaters, and floating piers named spuds that could adjust with the tides. These components had been prefabricated in England, hauled across the Channel by dozens of tugboats and landing ships, then painstakingly assembled under fire and in rough seas. The stakes were enormous. If the harbours failed, the invasion force would grind to a halt, starving for supplies and reinforcements. At the port of Arromanches, known as Mulberry Bay, soldiers and engineers worked feverishly. Navy Lieutenant Robert Mason described the scene: "We were building a city on the sea, with each block of brick, but the bricks weighed thousands of tons, and the sea was trying to tear it all apart." The first few days were promising. Supply ships docked, unloading vehicles, men, and equipment. Trucks rolled off the floating roadways and disappeared into the newly secured territory. But then disaster struck. On June 19th, barely 2 weeks after the invasion, a ferocious storm battered the Normandy coast. Waves smashed against the fragile harbour, tearing apart the floating roadways and sinking dozens of Phoenix caissons. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach was destroyed. Mulberry B, though damaged, held on. For the soldiers stranded on the beaches, the loss was devastating. Supplies were delayed, reinforcements slowed, and the enemy seized the moment to counterattack. But the Allied engineers refused to surrender. Repairs began immediately, improvisation became the rule, and the resilience of the men shone through. The floating harbour at Aromenches was patched, reinforced, and transformed into a vital artery that kept the invasion alive. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, Operation Pluto was quietly coming to life. Fuel was the lifeblood of the modern army. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, and planes all depended on it. Shipping fuel in drums was slow and vulnerable to attack. The idea was to lay pipelines under the channel, pumping petrol directly from England to the continent. It was a colossal technical challenge. The pipelines had to be flexible, durable, and capable of withstanding the sea's pressure and shifting tides. Engineers tested different designs, eventually settling on two types: the flexible Hamel pipe and the steel Helaise pipe, armored for underwater deployment. Thousands of miles of pipe were manufactured in secret, then spooled onto massive drums, ready to be laid by specialized cable-laying ships. On the night of August 2nd, 1944, the first Pluto pipeline was laid across the channel, a silent ribbon of hope beneath the waves. It took months to pump millions of gallons of fuel through these secret pipes, fueling the Allied push inland. Soldiers on the front lines often didn't realize the critical role these unseen lifelines played. Corporal Alan Green, a tanker driver, later said, "We always joked we were the fuel army, but without those pipes, we'd have been stuck in the mud." The success of the Mulberry harbours and Operation Pluto was not just a triumph of engineering, it was a testament to human ingenuity and determination under fire. The sea was an enemy to be conquered, and these floating harbours and secret pipes were the weapons of choice. They allowed the Allies to sustain their forces, build momentum, and eventually break out of Normandy. But the battle was far from over. The harbours remained vulnerable to storms and sabotage, and the pipelines, hidden beneath the waves, depended on secrecy and constant maintenance. Would these fragile lifelines hold as the Allies pressed deeper into France? Could they keep the wheels of liberation turning against fierce German resistance? The answer would shape the fate of the invasion and the future of Europe itself. For now, the engineers and soldiers labored on, turning the impossible into reality, one floating block and secret pipe at a time. The war was being won not just with bullets and bombs, but with steel, sweat, and ingenuity beneath the waves, and the world watched, breath held, as the tide of history turned. The night was ripped apart by a sudden, thunderous explosion. A railway bridge crumbled into the darkness, twisted steel and burning timber collapsing into the river below. The sound echoed through the silent countryside, an act of defiance, a strike against an invisible enemy. In the shadowed villages and forests of Normandy, ordinary men and women were becoming extraordinary. They were the French resistance, the silent heartbeat of liberation, striking from the shadows behind enemy lines. Their story was one of courage, born not from armies or generals, but from people whose homes had been stolen, whose lives had been shattered by war. In a land gripped by fear and oppression, they chose to fight in secret, risking everything for a chance at freedom. The resistance was many things: saboteurs, spies, couriers, and guides. They sabotaged railroads, destroyed German communications, ambushed patrols, and provided crucial intelligence to the Allied commanders planning the invasion. But each act of rebellion came at a high cost. The Nazis hunted them relentlessly, punishing entire villages for the actions of a few. Captives faced torture, execution, or deportation to brutal concentration camps. Yet the flame of resistance only burned brighter. In the months leading up to D-Day, coded messages crackled through hidden radios. Phrases like "the Red Fox trots at midnight" signaled that sabotage should begin. With precision and daring, Resistance fighters struck key railway lines, cutting off German reinforcements and supplies. Factories ground to a halt, and transport convoys found themselves stranded. The chaos sown by these hidden warriors was a vital part of the Allies' plan, disrupting the enemy's ability to respond to the invasion. Among the resistance fighters was Jean Moulin, a symbol of unity and hope. Moulin worked tirelessly to bring the scattered groups together, forging a coordinated force from a fractured underground. His leadership helped transform small pockets of defiance into an organized movement that could strike with greater impact. In the quiet town of Saint-Lô, a group of partisans carefully laid explosives beneath the railway tracks. Under cover of darkness, they worked swiftly, their hands steady despite the danger. When the charges detonated, German supply trains ground to a halt miles away, stranded and vulnerable to attack. In another village, Simone Seguin, barely 18, slipped past German sentries with a pistol in hand. Embodying the fierce spirit of youth turned warrior, she fought alongside men, inspiring others with her bravery. The resistance was not just men in hiding, it was women and children too, silent partners in a struggle for survival and freedom. The Allies knew that without this underground army, the invasion could have faltered. The resistance was the unseen force that disrupted enemy lines, provided intelligence, and kept hope alive in occupied France. But their actions came with terrible consequences. In brutal reprisals, the Nazis burned villages, executed civilians, and waged a merciless campaign to crush the spirit of rebellion. Families lived in fear, hiding loved ones in cellars, whispering warnings through shuttered windows. Yet the resistance fighters never ceased. They knew that the fight for freedom was worth any price. As Allied forces landed on the beaches, resistance groups rose in coordinated uprisings, attacking German garrisons and securing key points behind the lines. Their knowledge of the terrain, the people, and the enemy's weaknesses became invaluable. Together, these brave men and women turned the tide in ways unseen by the world. But the war was far from over. Would the resistance survive the brutal counterattacks? Could they continue to strike fear into the heart of the occupation? The coming months would test their resolve as never before. The story of the French resistance is a story of ordinary people transformed by extraordinary courage. Their fight was a vital thread in the tapestry of liberation, woven in shadows, sacrifice, and hope. The world would remember them not just as fighters, but as the soul of a nation refusing to be conquered. The dawn was breaking over the Norman coast, but for Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the day had already become a living nightmare. Reports flooded in ships approaching, landing craft spilling soldiers onto the beaches, the thunder of artillery shaking the earth beneath his feet. The fortress he had helped build, the Atlantic Wall, was under siege. Yet nothing about this invasion fit the scripts of victory he had so meticulously prepared. Rommel, the Desert Fox, a man renowned for his tactical brilliance and bold maneuvers, now faced a foe unlike any he had encountered before. A massive, coordinated assault that threatened to tear through the very heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. He had feared this moment for months. His warnings had been dismissed by Berlin, his requests for more troops and armor ignored. He knew the Allies would strike across the Channel, but the scale, the timing, the cunning deception that preceded the attack, it all caught the German High Command off guard. Rommel's nightmare was not just the invasion itself, but the cracks in the German defenses, the weaknesses that could not be fixed overnight. The Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, mines, and gun emplacements stretching thousands of miles along the coast, was formidable, but it was never meant to withstand the overwhelming firepower and sheer numbers that now crashed upon it. Rommel believed the key to victory lay in stopping the invasion before it could fully take hold, destroy the Allied forces on the beaches, crush them in the surf before they could bring their full weight inland. But time was against him. He faced impossible choices. Should he commit his armored divisions immediately, risking them to piecemeal destruction under Allied air superiority, or wait to concentrate his forces, potentially giving the enemy the precious hours to establish a foothold? Rommel chose boldness. He pushed for immediate counterattacks, desperate to drive the invaders back into the sea. He personally inspected the front lines, walking among the soldiers, urging them to hold fast, inspiring confidence even as the tide turned against them. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, Rommel wrestled with fear and frustration. The communications he needed were slow or cut, the terrain filled with dense hedgerows, complicated rapid movement. The Allies' air dominance blinded and crippled German reinforcements. Rommel's nightmare deepened as he realized the invasion was not a single isolated strike, but a massive coordinated assault stretching across miles of coastline. The deception campaigns, Operation Bodyguard and others had succeeded brilliantly. He had been misled into expecting the attack at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. This split his forces and left him vulnerable. Still, Rommel refused to concede defeat. He ordered his troops to fight fiercely, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. His men fought with a tenacity born of desperation, holding bunkers and strongpoints even as the Allies pushed forward. But the clock was running out. Rommel knew that without rapid, decisive action, the German hold on France would crumble. His nightmare was far from over. Would his strategies be enough to stem the tide? Could he rally a shattered army to turn the course of the battle? The answer lay in the brutal days ahead, as Normandy became the stage for one of history's most pivotal struggles. Rommel's nightmare was just beginning, and the world would soon witness a clash that would shape the destiny of nations. The early morning mist clung to the ground like a heavy shroud, but it offered no comfort to the soldiers trudging through the dense, twisted maze of hedgerows that wove across the Normandy countryside. For the Allied troops pushing inland after the brutal landings on D-Day, the bocage was a nightmare, a landscape transformed into a deadly fortress by nature and war combined. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with thick shrubs and trees, rose like stone walls, often 10 feet high, formed by centuries of farmers piling earth and roots to mark their fields. To the casual eye, they might have seemed quaint, even peaceful, but to those who fought there, they were lethal barriers, twisting the countryside into a labyrinth of fields and narrow lanes, hiding German defenders ready to strike at every turn. This was not open battlefield warfare, where massed tanks and infantry could maneuver freely. Here every step forward was a struggle, every hedge was a wall, and every field was a prison. American soldiers described it as fighting in a green hell. The bocage neutralized many of the Allies' advantages: vast numbers, heavy artillery, and powerful tanks, forcing them into slow, grinding battles of attrition. Tanks, once unstoppable beasts on the open plains, became vulnerable and often trapped in the hedgerows. Their main guns could not angle high enough to fire over the thick earth walls. German infantry, expertly concealed in dugouts and camouflaged foxholes, had the upper hand. From behind these natural ramparts, they launched deadly ambushes and sniper fire. Communication between units broke down amid the tangled terrain, leaving squads isolated and forced to fight alone. For the soldiers on the ground, fear was constant. Every hedge could hide a machine gun nest. Every rustle could mean a hidden enemy. The claustrophobic conditions heightened the tension. There was no room to maneuver, no easy retreat. Lieutenant Robert Wilson, of the 1st Infantry Division, recalled the terror vividly. You couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. One wrong move, and you were in a trap. The hedgerows swallowed men whole. The terrain itself became a weapon of war. German defenders had long used the bocage to their advantage, reinforcing it with barbed wire, mines, and explosive traps. The narrow lanes forced attacking troops into predictable paths where defenders awaited with deadly precision. The Allies quickly realized that standard tactics would not work. They had to innovate. Engineers began modifying tanks, welding on massive metal prongs known as rhino tanks to cut through the hedgerows like giant garden shears. These modifications allowed armored units to punch through the earthen walls, opening new routes and preventing ambushes from dictating the battlefield. Yet, progress remained agonizingly slow. Each advance required painstaking clearing of fields, houses, and lanes, often under fire. Infantry fought side by side with engineers, constantly on alert for hidden explosives and enemy positions. Casualties were high. In a single day, some units lost dozens of men to sniper fire, booby traps, and fierce close-quarters combat. Medics worked tirelessly under fire, pulling the wounded from shattered hedgerows, often with little hope of immediate evacuation. The bocage was a war within a war, a brutal, grinding conflict that tested every soldier's courage, endurance, and will to survive. Despite the hardships, the Allies pushed forward, knowing the stakes were immense. Breaking through the bocage was essential to link the beachheads, cut off German reinforcements, and open the road to Paris and beyond. French civilians caught in the crossfire lived in constant fear. Villages were destroyed, homes were burned, and families were displaced as the fighting raged. Yet many quietly supported the Allies, offering shelter, information, and aid where they could. The bocage was not just a landscape, it was a trap, a challenge born of history and geography that forced both sides into brutal, desperate combat. As the weeks wore on, the Allies learned, adapted, and endured. The green maze of Normandy would not hold them forever, but the cost was paid in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Would the soldiers find a way to overcome the deadly bocage? Could they break the German hold and open the path to liberation? The answer lay just beyond the next hedge, hidden, dangerous, and uncertain. The battle through the bocage was a test of resolve, a crucible that would shape the course of the war and the fate of Europe itself. The town of Carentan lay in ruins, its streets choked with rubble and its buildings reduced to skeletal frames. The air was thick with smoke, gunfire, and the sharp scent of gunpowder, a haunting reminder of the fierce struggle that had engulfed this small piece of Normandy. This battle was more than just a fight for territory. It was a crucial effort to connect the Allied forces who had stormed the beaches of Utah and Omaha. Without control of Carentan, the invasion risked fracturing into isolated pockets, vulnerable and cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Carentan was the vital link, the chain that would bind the beachheads into a unified front capable of pushing the Germans back. The stakes could not have been higher. In the early hours after D-Day, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division had descended behind enemy lines, scattered across the countryside in a chaotic drop. Though many landed miles from their intended zones, their orders were clear: seize Carentan and hold it at all costs. These young soldiers, barely out of their teens, faced seasoned German troops dug deep into fortified positions within the town. The German defenders were battle-hardened veterans from the 6th Parachute Regiment and elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. They knew the terrain intimately and had transformed Carentan into a fortress, barricading streets, rigging buildings with explosives, and preparing deadly ambushes. The battle quickly devolved into savage street fighting, an ugly, grueling contest that tested every ounce of courage and endurance. Each street corner was a potential death trap. Every doorway might conceal a sniper's rifle or a grenade ready to be tossed. The close quarters meant that combat was often hand-to-hand, brutal and merciless. Soldiers moved cautiously, clearing houses room by room. The chaos of battle was amplified by the limited visibility from the smoke and dust. Lieutenant James Miller remembered the horror vividly. You had to keep your wits about you. One wrong move, and you were dead. The Germans fought fiercely, but so did we. No one was backing down. Radio communication was sporadic at best. The dense buildings and thick stone walls disrupted signals, forcing small units to operate independently, relying on trust and rapid decisions in the heat of combat. The American paratroopers, exhausted and outnumbered, held their ground as infantry from the beaches pushed toward the town. This coordinated assault was critical. If Carnage fell, the beaches would be linked, allowing the free flow of troops, vehicles, and supplies essential for the next phase of the invasion. The fighting was relentless. On June 16th and 17th, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack, later known as the Battle of Bloody Gulch. SS Panzer units, including tanks and mechanized infantry, poured into the countryside, aiming to retake Carentan and sever the fragile Allied connection. The ground became a deadly quagmire of artillery barrages, tank fire, and small arms battles. American forces, weary from days of continuous fighting, faced waves of fierce enemy assaults. Despite the overwhelming firepower and ferocity of the counterattack, the Allies dug in, refusing to yield. Artillery strikes were called in with precision, and infantrymen fought in defiant defense of every inch of terrain. Tanks and infantry worked in unison, with soldiers protecting the armor from enemy infantry, while the tanks hammered German positions. The battlefield was a chaotic swirl of smoke, fire, and shouted orders. Soldiers faced not only the enemy, but the brutal conditions, as the relentless rain turned the fields into mud, making movement difficult and slowing reinforcements. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, leading one of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment's battalions, recalled the determination that carried them through. We knew the fate of the invasion depended on holding Carentan. We fought like our lives depended on it, because they did. Civilian lives were caught in the crossfire. Many residents of Carentan had fled before the fighting reached their streets. Those who remained faced unimaginable hardship, homes destroyed, food scarce, and the constant fear of violence. The town bore witness to the harsh reality of war, its destruction a testament to the price of liberation. Despite the fierce German resistance, the Allies' resolve did not falter. Reinforcements arrived steadily from the beachheads, bringing fresh troops, supplies, and hope. Together, paratroopers and infantry pushed forward, tightening the noose around the German defenders. After days of brutal combat, the German forces began to retreat, their attempts to reclaim Carentan finally broken. The capture and defense of Carentan marked a turning point. With the town secure, the Allied beachheads were linked, allowing a steady stream of men and material to move inland. This critical connection bolstered the invasion's momentum, setting the stage for the relentless push toward liberation. The battle showed the harsh truth of war. It was fought not only on open fields but in broken towns, among shattered buildings and narrow streets. Victory was measured in small gains and costly sacrifices. For the soldiers who fought and died in Carentan, it was a battle for survival and hope, a desperate struggle to turn the tide of history. The link held, but the war was far from over. As the Allies looked beyond Carentan, they faced new challenges, fierce resistance, and a land scarred by conflict. Would the courage and sacrifice of these men be enough to carry the invasion forward? The answer lay ahead in the unforgiving battles yet to come. Corentin was just the beginning, and the fight for Normandy and for Europe's future was only intensifying. The dawn broke over the jagged coastline of Normandy, the pale light struggling through thick clouds heavy with rain and smoke. The once bustling port city of Cherbourg was cloaked in silence, a calm before the storm that had been brewing for weeks. On the horizon, the thunder of tanks and the rumble of thousands of soldiers marching forward cut through the stillness. This was no ordinary battle. Cherbourg was the prize that could make or break the entire Allied invasion. Without its massive harbour, the Allies faced a grim reality. Their armies landing on Normandy's beaches could quickly become isolated, stranded on hostile soil, without the steady flow of men, weapons, and supplies critical for a sustained campaign. The port was the lifeline for Operation Overlord, the essential artery through which the tide of war would surge. Commanders on both sides understood this painfully well. For the Allies, capturing Cherbourg swiftly was crucial to turning a costly beachhead into a launching point for liberation. For the Germans, defending it was a matter of honor and desperation, a bulwark to hold, the last bastion against the relentless Allied advance. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the architect of Germany's Atlantic Wall, had transformed Cherbourg into a fortress. Concrete bunkers lined the coastline, massive artillery pieces bristled on the cliffs and in the city, and minefields sprawled like a deadly web over every approach. German engineers had scoured the city, rigging bridges with explosives and stockpiling ammunition to prepare for a battle of attrition. The defenders were a formidable mix of veteran soldiers, seasoned paratroopers, panzer grenadiers, and naval infantry, well-trained, fiercely loyal, and ready to fight to the bitter end. As the Allied forces closed in, the city became a crucible of combat unlike any seen in the campaign so far. The 79th Infantry Division, supported by armoured units, began their assault in early June, pushing through fields turned muddy by relentless rain and constant shelling. From the first contact, the Germans fought with a tenacity born of desperation. Machine gun nests opened fire from shattered buildings, sniper bullets whizzed through broken windows, and artillery slammed into the advancing columns. Every street in Cherbourg was a battleground, rubble-strewn and lined with the dead and wounded. Close quarters fighting became the grim norm. Soldiers cleared houses with grenades and rifles, advancing room by room through darkened corridors filled with smoke and danger. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hayes described the nightmare vividly. It was like fighting inside a tomb. The enemy was everywhere, and the air was thick with fear and gunpowder. One wrong step, and you were dead. The Americans quickly realized that brute force alone would not win this battle. Engineers played a critical role, carefully dismantling booby traps and clearing mines laid by the retreating Germans. They repaired roads, built bridges, and worked under fire to keep supply lines open. No easy task amid the constant shelling and sniper attacks. The Germans, refusing to surrender, implemented scorched earth tactics to slow the Allies. They demolished docks, tore up railways, and blew up cranes, turning the port's once proud infrastructure into piles of twisted metal and rubble. This destruction complicated the Allies' plans, forcing them to improvise as they raced against time to make the port functional again. The battle was a war of attrition, with heavy casualties on both sides. The relentless pace wore down the soldiers physically and mentally. Sleep was a luxury few could afford, and food and medical supplies were often scarce. Amid the carnage, acts of extraordinary bravery emerged. Corporal James Mitchell, under heavy fire, repeatedly ran through enemy lines to bring wounded comrades to safety, embodying the courage and humanity that persisted even in the hellish conditions. But the battle was far from over. In mid-July, the Germans launched desperate counterattacks, deploying tanks and infantry in an attempt to retake lost ground. The 9th Infantry Division faced fierce armoured assaults near the outskirts of the city. Tank commanders maneuvered through the shattered streets, firing at anything that moved. American anti-tank teams, armed with bazookas and explosives, engaged in deadly duels to hold the line. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting. Yet, despite the ferocity of the German defense and the devastation wrought by the retreating forces, the Allies' determination never faltered. Commanders coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in a relentless push that slowly but surely broke the German grip on Cherbourg. On July 26, after nearly 3 weeks of intense combat, the American flag was raised over the battered city hall. Cherbourg had fallen. The victory was more than symbolic. It was strategic. Though the port was badly damaged, it could now be repaired and used to supply the Allied advance. Engineers and workers began clearing debris, fixing docks, and restoring operations under the protection of frontline troops. The battle for Cherbourg revealed the true cost of war, a cost paid in blood, sacrifice, and the destruction of a city. Civilians who had stayed behind endured unimaginable hardship, homes destroyed, families separated, and lives forever changed. Yet the capture of Cherbourg opened the floodgates for the Allied war machine. Supplies, tanks, and reinforcements flowed into France, fueling the relentless push across the continent. The race for Cherbourg was a race against time, destruction, and a determined enemy. In the end, it was a story of perseverance, innovation, and the unyielding human spirit. But as the Allies looked beyond the battered port, they knew the war was far from over. New battles loomed on the horizon, each demanding the courage and sacrifice that had brought them this far. Cherbourg was won, but the fight for Normandy and the liberation of Europe had only just begun. The rain fell relentlessly over the Normandy countryside, turning fields into thick mud and the skies into a curtain of grey that seemed to swallow the horizon. The earth trembled with the roar of tanks and the pounding march of thousands of soldiers, their faces streaked with grime and exhaustion. The battle for Calmes was underway, a city that stood like a stubborn fortress amid the chaos of war, refusing to yield to the advancing Allied forces. Operation Epsom was British General Bernard Montgomery's plan for a decisive breakthrough. It was a gamble of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower, a grinding offensive intended to outflank the German defenders and seize the vital city of Calais. But from the very first moment, the operation would test every ounce of courage, discipline, and ingenuity the British forces could muster. The opening hours were brutal. Under a sky swollen with rain, infantrymen struggled across fields soaked through with water and churned to mud by the relentless pounding of tank tracks and shell fire. Each step was a battle in itself, as men waded through knee-deep mud that sucked at their boots like unseen hands, threatening to pull them under. Tanks and artillery thundered forward, their engines growling as they churned the earth, while overhead, British fighter planes darted and dived to support the ground assault. Yet, every movement was met with fierce German resistance. The panzer divisions defending Caen, some of the best trained and most determined troops in the Wehrmacht, countered with ferocious tenacity. Among them was the 12th SS Panzer Division, known as the Hitler Jugend, composed largely of fanatical, battle-hardened youth who had earned a fearsome reputation for ruthless combat. The British infantry and tank crews quickly realized this would not be a swift victory. Machine gun nests raked the advancing lines, and artillery shells exploded with devastating force, hurling earth, metal, and flesh into the air. The battlefield echoed with the relentless staccato of rifles, the thunderous booms of mortars, and the shrill whistle of incoming shells. Lieutenant Thomas Edwards, a British infantry officer, later described the hellish conditions. The rain was a constant companion, cold and merciless. It blurred our vision, soaked our clothes, and turned the fields into a quagmire. Progress was measured not in miles, but in inches. The terrain itself became a deadly adversary. Normandy's famous bocage country, thick hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields bordered by dense shrubbery, transformed the battlefield into a maze of ambush points and hidden threats. These hedgerows broke up formations, forcing soldiers into narrow, vulnerable paths where German defenders lay in wait, ready to strike. Tanks found themselves trapped, unable to maneuver effectively, while infantry fought in brutal close quarters, often face to face with enemy soldiers in cramped hedgerow ditches or ruined farmhouses. The communication lines among the British commanders strained under the chaos. Radios often failed amid the interference and the relentless barrage, leaving officers to rely on runners, brave men who dashed through the crossfire to deliver orders, risking death with every step. Commanders worked feverishly to coordinate artillery support, hoping to suppress German defences long enough for the infantry to advance. Artillery was the British hammer, pounding enemy positions in a creeping barrage that slowly pushed forward ahead of the troops, like a shield of fire. Yet the German defenders were skilled at weathering these assaults, frequently regrouping and launching counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. The battle became a brutal war of attrition, with both sides suffering heavy casualties as the front lines twisted back and forth across the muddy fields. Captain Sarah Williams, a British field medic, recalled the horrors of the offensive. "We were running out of stretchers. Men were wounded and bleeding, some trapped in the mud, others crying out for help we couldn't always reach. The rain blurred faces and blood alike, but we never stopped." Despite the hardship, the British forces adapted. Tanks were fitted with improvised hedgerow cutters, massive blades designed to slice through the dense shrubbery and allow armoured vehicles to push forward. This innovation helped turn the tide in localized battles. Though progress remained slow and costly, supplies and reinforcements were continually fed to the front lines, even as the weather and enemy fire made the task perilous. Montgomery's goal was clear: seize the high ground south and west of Caen, break through the German defences, and open the way for a broader advance into Normandy's interior. Yet the Germans had no intention of yielding. Field Marshal Rommel, overseeing the defence, directed reserves and orchestrated fierce counterattacks, throwing fresh troops and tanks into the fight whenever the British seemed poised to break through. One of the fiercest clashes occurred near the village of Scher, where British infantry and German tanks engaged in brutal close-range fighting, with soldiers exchanging fire from shattered buildings and foxholes mere yards apart. The fighting was desperate and personal. At times the artillery barrages lifted, leaving an eerie silence filled only by the distant cries of the wounded and the occasional shout of orders. Throughout the offensive, the morale of the British troops was tested beyond measure. Men who had trained together faced the daily terror of losing their comrades, the weight of exhaustion, and the gnawing uncertainty of survival. Yet, amidst the carnage, acts of extraordinary valor shone through the gloom. Sergeant Robert Phillips, armed only with a rifle and grenades, single-handedly held off a German machine gun nest for hours, preventing the enemy from flanking his company, an act that saved countless lives and earned him a distinguished medal. As the days wore on, the muddy fields and battered hedgerows bore witness to the unyielding spirit of the British soldiers. Operation Epsom slowed the German defences and forced their elite panzer divisions into a grinding battle of attrition. While the offensive did not achieve all its immediate territorial objectives, it weakened the enemy and drew German forces away from other critical sectors, easing pressure on the American fronts. Montgomery himself acknowledged the costs and challenges, but remained resolute in his vision. The battle for Cayenne was a key to the larger campaign, and victory would come not in swift leaps, but in hard-fought inches. As the offensive drew to a close, the battered British troops dug in along new defensive lines, weary but unbroken. The skies began to clear, but the shadow of war still hung heavy over Normandy. The question lingered: would the British push beyond the muddy fields and thorny hedgerows to finally seize Cannes, the city so fiercely defended? The answer awaited in the battles yet to come. Operation Epsom was a testament to the grim reality of war, a conflict defined by sacrifice, innovation, and the relentless will to prevail. And as the soldiers caught their breath and prepared for the next assault, the war for Normandy pressed onward, shaping the destiny of a continent. The sky over Cannes darkened with the thunder of Allied bombers, hundreds of planes streaking across the clouds like a relentless swarm. Below, the city waited, its ancient stone walls and narrow streets about to become a battlefield unlike any other, a place where the destruction came not only from ground forces but from the sky itself. The bombing of Cannes was more than just a military operation. It was a tragic paradox, destroying a city in order to save it. The Allies had to break the iron grip of the German defenders, who had turned Cannes into a fortress, but to do so they had to lay waste to homes, schools, and churches. The very heart of Normandy was about to be torn apart. In the early hours of July 5, 1944, the first waves of bombers unleashed their deadly payloads. Thousands of tons of bombs rained down in coordinated strikes, designed to target German fortifications, supply depots, and communication centers embedded deep within the city's urban fabric. From the air, Cannes was a maze of stone and shadow, where every building could hide a sniper, every street corner a hidden machine gun nest. To the Allied commanders, the city had to be flattened. Only then could infantry and armor push through and claim victory. But the bombing's effects rippled far beyond military objectives. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Churches with centuries of history crumbled to dust, and homes that had stood for generations were shattered in seconds. Streets became rivers of fire and ash, and choking smoke blurred the skies. Marie Levrard, a young schoolteacher, survived the bombing by sheltering in a cold, cramped cellar with her family. She recalled the terrifying moments. The ground shook as if the earth itself was screaming. Walls collapsed above us, and the air was thick with dust and fear. We held each other tight, listening to the bombs fall, wondering if we would live to see the morning. The suffering of common civilians was immense. Tens of thousands had already fled before the bombing began, but many remained trapped, too poor, too old, or too terrified to leave. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded, many arriving in shock, their bodies torn by shrapnel or crushed beneath fallen debris. British and Canadian medics worked tirelessly amid the ruins, their faces stained with soot and exhaustion. Captain Sarah Williams, a medic assigned to the front, described the relentless pace. "We treated men and women alike, soldiers and civilians. The cries for help never stopped. Sometimes the worst injuries were not from the bombs, but from the fear and hopelessness that followed." From a tactical perspective, the bombing was a calculated risk. The Allies understood that destroying Kazan would cause civilian casualties and obliterate a cultural treasure, but they weighed this against the cost of a prolonged battle that could drain thousands more lives on both sides. The city was a linchpin, its capture essential to opening a corridor deeper into occupied France, but the Germans had anticipated the danger. In response, they reinforced their positions and rigged the ruins with traps and mines. The city's devastation made movement perilous for the attackers. What should have been a tactical advantage for the Allies became a double-edged sword, as shattered buildings turned into deadly sniper nests and booby-trapped alleyways. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a German officer, wrote in his diary, "We were fighting a ghost city. The buildings were gone, but so was any sense of safety. Every corner hid death, but we fought on out of duty, desperation, or maybe madness." The bombing campaign continued for weeks. Night and day, Allied aircraft returned, dropping incendiaries and high explosives designed to suppress German fire and clear a path for the advancing troops. The result was a city unrecognizable from the one that had stood only months before, with streets blocked by rubble, landmarks erased, and lives irrevocably changed. For General Montgomery, the destruction was a necessary sacrifice in a war where every inch of ground cost blood and tears. He famously remarked that the city was a fortress that had to be broken at any cost, a brutal truth weighed against the hope for liberation. But the bombing also ignited a fierce debate among Allied commanders and historians. Some questioned if the massive destruction truly hastened victory or merely prolonged the agony. Could the Allies have fought differently, more precisely, with less devastation? The question remains a haunting legacy of the battle. Amid the ruins, life endured. Survivors like Marie Levrard and countless others began the slow process of rebuilding not only their homes, but their shattered communities. They bore witness to both the horrors of war and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. As the Allied infantry finally moved into Cannon, they stepped through streets that were a battlefield of stone and silence. Resistance pockets still held out in the shattered buildings, and every step forward was met with fierce German fire. The city's destruction had made it no less dangerous. If anything, it had transformed it into a grim labyrinth of death. The bombing of Caen stands as a sobering chapter in the history of the Normandy campaign. It encapsulates the brutal choices faced in war, where the path to freedom often comes wrapped in fire and ruin. And as the dust settled over the shattered city, the battle for Normandy was far from over. The road ahead would demand more sacrifice, courage, and resolve. But for Caen, the fires of destruction also marked the first flickers of liberation. The early dawn of August 6, 1944, cracked open with a roar that shook the forests around Mortain, a small town nestled deep in the Norman countryside. The rumble was not the gentle awakening of a peaceful morning, but the brutal advance of tanks, artillery, and infantry, a desperate thunderstorm of steel and fire unleashed by Hitler himself. It was his last major gamble on the Western Front, a bold and dangerous attempt to cut through the Allied lines, isolate the American forces driving deep into France, and reverse the tide of war. The stakes could not have been higher. Mortain was more than just a town. It was a critical junction, a strategic linchpin that, if seized, could sever the supply routes feeding the Allied armies across Normandy. Hitler's hope was that this thunderous push could smash the Allies before their grip on France became unbreakable. But the gamble was fraught with risk, and as the first shells exploded, it became clear the price would be terrible. Lieutenant Karl Becker, a German tank commander, watched the battlefield through rain-smeared glass, his hands gripping the controls of his Panzer IV. "We were weary from months of fighting, yet the order was clear. Attack no matter the cost," he recalled years later. Morale was fragile, but we knew this could be the last chance for our side. There was fear, but also determination. The Führer had spoken. Yet, even as the German armored columns surged forward, the Americans were bracing for the storm. Intelligence had warned General Omar Bradley's U.S. First Army of the impending attack. Trenches were dug, artillery was placed on high ground, and tanks were positioned behind the thick hedgerows, the ancient earth walls of Normandy that had turned the countryside into a natural fortress. These hedgerows, dense with roots and underbrush, became both shield and trap in the brutal fighting to come. Private James O'Connor, an infantryman in the 30th Infantry Division, would later write home about those harrowing days. The Germans came like a flood, crashing through the woods with their tanks and guns. The hedgerows were a maze, each turn hiding an enemy waiting to kill. We lost so many friends, men I had laughed with that morning. We fought not just the enemy but the fear that gripped us all. The fighting was savage and chaotic. Tanks clanged against each other, the sound of metal grinding over muddy earth. The air was thick with smoke, the scent of burning fuel and earth. Artillery shells screamed overhead, sending dirt and debris into the sky. Infantrymen ducked and fired from behind shattered trees, the ground littered with the fallen. German troops pressed hard, but their offensive was hindered by overstretched supply lines and confused communications. The rapid advance created gaps in their coordination. Worse, the skies above Normandy belonged firmly to the Allies. Fighter planes roared through the clouds, swooping down to strafe German columns and disrupt their supply trucks. The destruction from above turned the roads into death traps, immobilizing armor and isolating infantry units. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, known for his leadership during the earlier Omaha beach landings, described the turning tide. The Germans came with fury, but they underestimated the will of our men and the might of our air power. The skies were a killing field, and our troops held the line with grit and determination. The battle for Morton was not just a clash of armies, but a test of endurance, will, and sheer survival. Soldiers on both sides faced relentless artillery barrages and sniper fire. The dense hedgerows, which once seemed a natural defense, became labyrinths of death. Trapped in the mud and under fire, men clung to hope as bullets zipped past and explosions shattered the earth around them. Amid the chaos, acts of courage and humanity shone through. Sergeant William McKenna, an American tank gunner, risked his life to rescue wounded comrades caught in no man's land. "War is hell," he said in an interview decades later. But in those moments, you fight not just the enemy, but to save the men next to you. But the relentless pressure began to tell on the German forces. Their tanks, though formidable, were outnumbered and targeted mercilessly by Allied artillery and aircraft. Fuel shortages crippled their mobility, and communications broke down, leaving units isolated and vulnerable. Lieutenant Becker's final message, before his tank was disabled, captured the despair. "We are surrounded. The attack is faltering. I fear this is the end." The failure of Hitler's counterattack at Morton was decisive. The Germans lost hundreds of tanks, thousands of men, and their last hope of pushing the Allies back into the sea. The offensive ended not with a victory, but with a retreat, one that signaled the beginning of the collapse of German resistance in Normandy. The civilian population bore a heavy toll as well. Villages near Morton were caught in the crossfire, their homes bombed or shelled, their families torn apart. In one farmhouse, the Leclerc family sheltered in their cellar, praying for the nightmare to end. The bombs shook the walls, Marie later recounted, and we could hear the cries of soldiers and neighbors. It was a darkness I will never forget. As the dust settled over the devastated fields and forests, the Allies seized the moment. The American advance resumed, pressing relentlessly toward liberation. Morton was a brutal but crucial chapter in that journey, a testament to both the cruelty of war and the resilience of those caught in its grip. The story of Morton reminds us that in the fog of battle, hope and despair coexist, and that even the boldest gambles can falter when met by determined resistance. It was a battle where courage met catastrophe, and where the fate of nations hung in the balance. But the war was far from over. Beyond Morton's shattered woods, the road to freedom stretched on, bloody, uncertain, and unforgiving. July of 1944 had been an unrelenting battle of attrition in Normandy. The Allied forces had landed on the beaches nearly 2 months earlier, but the terrain, an intricate web of hedgerows, rivers, and small villages, had transformed the countryside into a torturous maze of bloodshed. For weeks the soldiers had fought tooth and nail, often advancing only yards at a time. The American troops, battered and exhausted, were caught in a grinding stalemate. Supplies were stretched thin, the hedgerows were a natural fortress for the Germans, and morale was fraying. The dream of a swift victory was slipping away. But then, a bold plan was conceived. Operation Cobra. This was not merely another battle, it was the pivotal Breakout, a massive, coordinated offensive designed to smash through the German defenses west of Saint-Lô and unleash the full might of American armor. The goal was simple in theory: break the German lines, open the way for rapid advances, and sweep the enemy from the heart of France. Yet, as history would show, even the best-laid plans come wrapped in chaos. In the early hours of July 25, 1944, a thunderous roar shattered the stillness over the Norman skies. Hundreds of American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by fighter planes, unleashed a barrage of bombs on the German positions. The sky was filled with fire and thunder, the ground below rocked by explosions that tore trees apart, flattened hedgerows, and blasted trenches into craters. The earth seemed to convulse beneath the bombardment. For the men on the ground, the bombardment was both a beacon of hope and a harbinger of terror. Lieutenant Thomas Harris, a young infantry officer, recounted the terrifying moments as the bombs fell. The sky was like a furnace. We could see the bombs crashing down, the ground shaking beneath our feet. It was supposed to be our opening salvo, our chance to break free, but the chaos was overwhelming. Some of our own units were caught in the blast. Friendly fire, it tore through the men we fought alongside. I lost brothers that day, not to the enemy, but to the fury of our own air. This tragic mistake, a consequence of the fog of war, left many shaken. Yet the soldiers gritted their teeth and pressed on. Behind the smoke and fire, the American tanks rumbled forward. The armored beasts, Sherman tanks, rolled over the shattered hedgerows with relentless force. The hedgerows, which had been the nightmare of months, began to crumble under the weight of armor and artillery. Private James O'Connor, who had survived weeks of brutal fighting, remembered the moment the breakout began. It was like the sky cracked open and let loose hell. The Germans were reeling, but still fierce. We charged through the broken fields, the sound of gunfire all around, the smell of smoke thick in the air. We knew this was our chance, but the fight was far from over. General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army, had spent months preparing for this moment. He understood the stakes. The breakout had to be swift and decisive. The supply lines were strained, and time was against them. If Cobra succeeded, it would force the German army into a full retreat, unraveling months of fortified defenses. The Germans, under Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, knew the danger. They poured reserves into the line, calling in panzer divisions to stem the tide. Their artillery barked in defiance, and their infantry dug in to make every inch cost dearly. But the tide had turned. The skies, once filled with enemy fighters and flak, were now dominated by Allied air power. Fighter planes hunted German reinforcements and supply convoys mercilessly, strafing trucks and tanks. The destruction from above turned the German roads into death traps, slowing their response and isolating their units. Lieutenant Karl Becker, a panzer commander, described the chaos. Our tanks moved forward under constant threat. The air was filled with the roar of planes and the crackle of anti-aircraft fire. Supply trucks were blown apart on the roads. Communication broke down. It was a nightmare. We fought with everything we had, but the Americans were too strong. On the ground, the fighting was brutal. The shattered hedgerows had transformed the countryside into a blasted wasteland. Trees uprooted, fields cratered, villages reduced to rubble. Every farm, every ruined wall became a battleground. The Americans pushed forward with grim determination. Sherman tanks fired shells at hidden German bunkers. Infantrymen, supported by flamethrowers and bazookas, cleared out sniper nests and machine gun posts. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning fuel. The screams of the wounded and the thunder of artillery were constant companions. Captain William McKenna, an American tank gunner, recalled the horror and the brotherhood. We were surrounded by death, but we were brothers in that hell. When a comrade fell, we fought harder. When the tanks rolled through, we felt unstoppable, but every inch cost us dearly. The American breakthrough at Cobra was a combination of overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and sheer will. The German defenses, once a solid wall, began to fracture. Units were cut off, retreating in disarray. The once coordinated lines dissolved into pockets of isolated resistance. The breakout opened a floodgate. American armored divisions surged forward like a tidal wave, tanks and mechanized infantry racing across the Normandy countryside, capturing towns and cutting off German retreat routes. The Germans scrambled to plug the gaps, but their forces were stretched too thin. The breakout at Operation Cobra did more than just shatter the enemy lines. It shifted the momentum of the entire campaign. The liberation of St. Lo, a crucial road and rail hub, symbolized the breakthrough. The town had been dubbed the capital of ruins after months of bombardment, yet its capture opened the road east, deeper into occupied France. Behind the front line, the civilian population emerged from months of terror. Villagers returned to their homes amidst the rubble, hopeful yet wary of the fighting that still raged around them. Among the civilians was Marie Leclerc, who had hidden in a cellar during the bombings. We heard the bombs and the guns, but when the Americans came, there was a hope we hadn't felt in months. The streets were broken, but the promise of freedom was alive. The victory at Cobra came with a heavy price. Thousands of soldiers, American and German alike, had paid with their lives. The battlefield was a tapestry of sacrifice, of courage and loss woven together. Brigadier General Norman Cotter, a veteran leader, reflected on the cost. Operation Cobra was a turning point, but it was never free. Every breakthrough demands sacrifice. Every victory is bought with courage, with pain, with lives lost. As the Allied forces pushed forward, the Germans faced an impossible choice: hold and be encircled, or retreat, and abandon the ground they had fought so hard to defend. The defeat at Cobra shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the German defenses. The breakout marked the beginning of the end for German forces in Normandy. It was the moment when the relentless pressure of the Allies finally cracked open the door to liberation. Yet, even as the Americans raced forward, the road ahead was uncertain. The battle was far from over, and the cost of victory remained high. Operation Cobra stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of the soldiers who refused to be beaten. The men who fought through confusion, chaos, and tragedy to break the chains of occupation. The breakout from Normandy was not just a military maneuver, it was the turning point where hope ignited into unstoppable momentum, and as the sun set on that shattered landscape, the Allies knew the gates to freedom were finally opening. But the war for Europe's soul was still raging fiercely. The sun scorched the shattered fields of Normandy on August 12, 1944, but no warmth reached the hearts of the trapped German soldiers. They were caught in a tightening noose, a deadly trap closing from all sides. Men screamed for help, tanks roared in desperate defense, and the earth trembled beneath pounding artillery and aircraft bombs. This was the Falaise Pocket, the final desperate attempt by the German 7th Army to break free from the encirclement that would decide the fate of the Normandy campaign. For weeks, the Allied armies had pressed hard, squeezing the German forces into a shrinking circle. What had started as fierce battles in the hedgerows had evolved into a deadly encirclement. Now the fate of thousands hung on a knife's edge, trapped in a pocket of destruction with no clear way out. Field Marshal Günther von Klug and his commanders faced a nightmare they could not escape. The Allies had cut off their retreat, and the roads that once promised safety were now rivers of fire and death. Panic spread among the ranks, but the order was clear: hold the line or perish. The German soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and disoriented. For many this was a fight not just for victory, but for survival itself. The countryside echoed with the crackle of gunfire and the cries of the wounded. Tanks clashed with enemy armor, while artillery shells rained down like thunderbolts. The sky above was a relentless battlefield, filled with Allied fighter planes hunting the fleeing enemy. Sergeant Heinrich Müller, a tank crewman, described the horror. We were trapped. The roads were clogged with wrecks, burned-out tanks, trucks, and desperate men. There was no escape, only fighting to survive. Every moment felt like the end. Yet we fought on. The Allies had planned this encirclement carefully. The American forces under General Bradley pushed from the south and west, while the British and Canadian units under General Montgomery advanced from the north. Their goal was to close the pocket and trap the German forces inside. It was a battle of wits, courage, and sheer will. But the Germans were not ready to surrender. They fought fiercely to keep the escape routes open. Every village, every hill became a fortress. Machine gun and sniper nests slowed the Allied advance, and mines and booby traps littered the roads. The retreat became a nightmare of confusion and bloodshed. Captain Jean Dupont, a French resistance fighter working with the Allies, recalled the desperation. The Germans were like trapped animals, lashing out with everything they had. Civilians watched in fear, knowing this was the final chapter of years of occupation. The air was thick with smoke and fear. The roads leading out of the pocket were scenes of chaos. Columns of German soldiers, vehicles and refugees clogged the narrow lanes, desperately seeking a way through the tightening Allied noose. But the Allies were relentless. Fighter bombers strafed the columns from above, while artillery tore through the congested routes. The ground shook under the explosions, and the sky echoed with the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Michael Thompson, a pilot flying ground attack missions, described the carnage. We strafed the roads, aiming to cut off their retreat. It was brutal but necessary. We knew that letting them escape meant more fighting, more bloodshed ahead. As the pocket closed, the fate of thousands became a race against time. The trapped German forces included the elite 7th Army and remnants of other units, still fighting despite dwindling supplies and shattered morale. Many soldiers hid in the rubble of destroyed villages, hoping to survive the deadly gauntlet. The town of Falaise itself became a focal point of the battle. The Allies fought to secure the high ground around the town to close the final gaps in the encirclement. Street fighting erupted, with infantry battling house to house, room to room. Tanks rolled through the shattered streets, their guns blazing. The destruction was total. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets littered with debris and bodies. Corporal James Miller, an American infantryman, recounted the brutal urban combat. Every corner was a fight for survival. The Germans were desperate, but we were determined. Each step forward was paid for with blood. It was hell, but we knew the war depended on closing this pocket. Despite the overwhelming Allied pressure, the Germans mounted desperate counterattacks to reopen the escape routes. Tank units and infantry charged into the lines, attempting to break through and lead their comrades to safety. These assaults were fierce, but ultimately futile. The Allies' superior numbers, firepower, and air support sealed the trap. General Bradley's voice over the radio captured the tense mood. "Hold fast. We have them trapped. This is our moment, the moment to end the nightmare." But the battle was far from over. Even as the noose tightened, thousands of German soldiers continued to fight with a mixture of courage and desperation. They faced annihilation or capture, and many chose the bitter fight to the last bullet. In the shadows of the destroyed villages, stories of heroism emerged. Medics risked their lives to save the wounded. Soldiers shared their last rations, and letters were written, messages of love and hope sent in the darkest hours. The human spirit flickered amid the devastation. Private Klaus Weber, one of the trapped German soldiers, wrote in his diary, "We are surrounded. We fight because we must. My thoughts are with my family far away. If this is the end, I pray for peace." The closing of the Falaise pocket was not without controversy. Allied commanders debated the timing of the final push. Some argued for a swift closure, while others urged caution to avoid friendly fire incidents and unnecessary casualties. The chaotic nature of the battle meant that some German forces managed to slip through narrow gaps, escaping the trap. But the majority were cut off. The final days of the battle saw relentless bombardments, infantry assaults, and armored clashes. The landscape was scarred beyond recognition. Fields turned to mud, forests shattered, and towns leveled. When the dust finally settled, the Falaise pocket had sealed the fate of the German forces in Normandy. Over 50,000 German troops were captured or killed. The once mighty 7th Army was shattered. The road to Paris lay open. Field Marshal Montgomery declared the victory a decisive blow, but tempered it with the cost. Victory came with sacrifice. The destruction was immense, and the human toll was staggering. For the Allied soldiers, the battle marked a turning point, a moment when months of grueling combat culminated in a breakthrough that would hasten the liberation of France. For the Germans, it was a bitter defeat from which their Western Front would never recover. As the Allied forces advanced beyond Falaise, the battered German army retreated eastward in disarray, forced to regroup and defend against the inexorable push toward Germany itself. The Falaise pocket stands as one of the most dramatic and decisive moments of World War II. It was a testament to the power of coordination, courage, and relentless determination, but it was also a stark reminder of war's human cost, the shattered lives, the broken families, and the haunting scars left on a land torn by conflict. And as the sun set on the shattered fields of Normandy, the question remained, would the desperate German forces rise again, or had this battle truly marked the beginning of the end? The sun was setting over the peaceful village of Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10th, 1944, casting long shadows across the quiet lanes. The evening air, thick with the scent of summer blooms, held no hint of the horror about to unfold. In the blink of an eye, This serene place would become a charnel house, an unthinkable scene of violence and destruction that would stain the soul of France and echo through history as one of the darkest atrocities of World War II. Oradour was not just a village, it was a community, a tapestry of lives intertwined by family, faith, and simple hopes for the future. Children played in the streets, farmers tended their fields, and shopkeepers prepared to close for the day. But beneath this calm lay a fragile tension, one forged by years of occupation, resistance, and the ruthless machinery of war. On that fateful afternoon, a division of the Waffen-SS, the elite and feared paramilitary wing of Nazi Germany, swept into the village. Their arrival was sudden, brutal, and merciless. What followed would become a chilling testament to the horrors of war and the capacity for human cruelty. The soldiers ordered every man, woman, and child to gather in the village square under threat of death. Confused but obedient, the villagers assembled, neighbors clutching their children, the elderly supported by trembling hands, friends exchanging fearful glances. The air was thick with an ominous silence. Then, without warning, the massacre began. Men were separated from their families, marched away, and executed in cold blood. Women and children were locked inside the church, which was then set ablaze. The screams that echoed from the burning building pierced the night, a haunting chorus of despair and agony that no one could escape. Among the survivors, few could comprehend the scale of the atrocity. Marguerite Ruffenche, one of the handful of women who escaped the inferno, recounted the horror. "I thought it was the end. The flames were everywhere, people were crying, screaming. I hid beneath a pile of corpses and waited for death, but somehow I survived." The reasons for this massacre are complex and rooted in the chaos of the time. Oradour was targeted as an act of reprisal, a brutal warning against the growing French resistance, and an expression of Nazi terror designed to crush any hope of rebellion. The SS unit involved, the 2nd Panzer Division, was notorious for its ruthlessness. Their commander, Adolf Diekmann, believed Oradour harbored resistance fighters or was linked to partisan attacks against German forces. Whether this was true remains debated, but the response was disproportionate and indiscriminate. The village itself was destroyed utterly. Houses were torched, the church was reduced to smouldering ruins, and the cobblestone streets were stained with blood. Over 600 innocent lives were lost, men, women, and children alike. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, babies, all caught in the merciless sweep of Nazi fury. What followed the massacre was silence, an eerie, suffocating silence that blanketed the countryside. Survivors struggled to make sense of what had happened. The French people were shocked and horrified, their grief amplified by the scale of the atrocity. The massacre of Oradour was not an isolated incident. It was part of a wider pattern of Nazi reprisals across occupied Europe, where entire communities were punished for acts of resistance or suspected defiance. But the sheer brutality and cold calculation of Oradour made it stand out, a symbol of Nazi barbarism that could not be ignored. For the Allied forces advancing through Normandy, news of the massacre was a grim reminder of what was at stake. The fight was not just about territory or strategy, it was about saving lives, ending oppression, and restoring humanity. Lieutenant John Harris, an American infantryman who heard the news at the front, reflected on its impact. "We were angry that innocent people could be slaughtered like animals. It made us even more determined to win this war, to stop the madness." The French resistance used the atrocity as a rallying cry. Saboteurs and fighters intensified their efforts, Inspired by the memory of Orador and other martyrs, the village became a symbol of sacrifice and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. After the war, the ruins of Orador Surglane were preserved as a memorial, a frozen moment in time to remind future generations of the horrors of hatred and war. The decision was deliberate. The village would not be rebuilt but left as it was, broken, scarred, and silent, so that the ghosts of the past could never be forgotten. Visitors walk through the ruins today and hear the echoes of that terrible day. The blackened walls, shattered windows, and empty streets tell a story without words. A story of loss, courage, and the cost of war. Families of the victims have sought justice for decades. Trials were held. Some perpetrators faced punishment, but many escaped accountability. The shadow of Orador lingers still, a painful reminder of the limits of justice in a world torn by conflict. Orador's legacy is twofold: a warning and a call to remember. It warns of the depths to which humanity can sink when hatred and fear dominate. It calls on us to honor those who suffered by striving for peace, tolerance, and understanding. As the Battle of Normandy raged on, the tragedy of Orador was a stark contrast to the hope embodied by the Allied advance. It was a reminder that the path to liberation was paved with sacrifice, not just on the battlefield but in the hearts of civilians caught in the crossfire. The world remembers Orador not only for the horror, but for the resilience of those who survived, and the courage of those who continue to bear witness. Their voices speak across the decades, urging us never to forget. In the silence of the ruined village, amid the ghosts of the past, a question remains: how can humanity ensure that such darkness never falls again? The streets ran red, not just with the blood spilled on battlefields, but with years of pent-up fury and anguish unleashed. The once silent towns of Normandy, suffocated under the iron grip of occupation, now erupted in shouts and cries. The long-awaited liberation was here, but it came tangled with the raw, messy emotions of revenge and reckoning. It was August of 1944. The thunder of Allied tanks and the roar of liberation forces rolled relentlessly across the Norman countryside. Town after town fell free from the clutches of Nazi control. Yet, freedom was not a quiet thing. It was a storm, wild, unpredictable, fueled by the dreams and nightmares of those who had lived through the occupation. For 6 long years, the French had endured a world turned upside down, families torn apart, food scarce, fear everywhere. Neighbors watched each other cautiously, uncertain who was a friend or foe, who whispered secrets in the night or stood quietly with clenched fists. Now, with the Germans retreating and the Allied flags rising, years of silence and suffering spilled out. The liberation was a moment of joy, but also a moment when decades of pain demanded justice. When the oppressed rose up, the lines between right and wrong blurred in the rush of revenge. In villages and cities alike, the French people confronted those who had collaborated with the occupiers. The so-called collaborators were the neighbors who had betrayed friends, the officials who had aided Nazi policies, the informers who had handed over resistance fighters to their deaths. For many, justice was swift and brutal. In some towns, accusations flew like wildfire. Public trials were rare. Instead, mob justice ruled the streets. Women accused of having relationships with German soldiers, the horizontal collaborators, were humiliated publicly. Their heads were shaved bare, a mark of shame meant to expose their betrayal. They were paraded through streets, filled with shouting crowds. The humiliation was meant to erase their past, to cleanse the town of the occupation's stain. Jacques, a resistance fighter who had survived years in hiding, described the rawness of the moment. The pain was everywhere. People were hungry, not just for food but for truth and retribution. We didn't always know who deserved what, but when the Germans fled, the anger poured out. It was as if the war had exploded inside us all at once. The French resistance, once underground and secretive, stepped into the light. Their courage, their sacrifices were finally visible and honored. They helped lead the liberation efforts, guiding Allied forces through a labyrinth of information and local knowledge. Their fight had been silent, shadowed, but now it was loud and proud. Yet the aftermath was complicated. Revenge could be cruel, and not every accusation was just. Families were torn apart by suspicion and fear. Some innocent people paid the price for the sins of others. The chaos of liberation was both a catharsis and a tragedy. Meanwhile, the Allies moved methodically to secure Normandy. The liberation was a military and logistical feat. Thousands of towns and villages had to be cleared, supply lines established, and civilians protected. The war was not over, far from it. But with every liberated town, the hope of peace grew stronger. In Kherson, a city reduced to rubble by months of fierce fighting and bombing, survivors emerged from hiding. They found their homes destroyed, their lives changed forever. Yet the sight of Allied soldiers hoisting the French flag filled them with hope. "We had been living in shadows," said Madeleine, a schoolteacher, "but now the sun was rising again. We were free, and we would rebuild." Rebuilding was a massive task. The war had left deep scars, not only in the buildings, but in the hearts and minds. Orphaned children wandered the streets, and elderly people who had seen too much clung to memories that sometimes felt like chains. Survivors of concentration camps, resistance fighters battered by trauma, all sought a place in this new world. The liberation also marked a turning point for the French government. General Charles de Gaulle returned to Paris to lead a provisional government. His voice, steady and commanding, called for unity and renewal. Yet he understood the fractures that remained. Rebuilding a nation meant healing wounds, both physical and emotional. De Gaulle faced the enormous challenge of reconciling a country divided by years of occupation and collaboration. France, he declared, must be reborn from the ashes of war, stronger and united. His words resonated, but the path was fraught with difficulties. Among those difficulties were the trials of war criminals and collaborators. The épuration légale. The legal purge sought to bring many to justice. Courts were established to investigate and prosecute crimes against the state and humanity. High-profile trials, like that of Marshal Pétain, the leader of Vichy France, who had cooperated with the Nazis, captivated the nation. But justice was a double-edged sword. Some saw the trials as necessary, a way to reckon with the past. Others feared they were too harsh, or that political motives overshadowed fairness. The scars of occupation ran too deep for easy answers. Across Normandy, the people faced a delicate balance, celebrating liberation while mourning their losses. Town squares once filled with Nazi flags now hosted gatherings where families shared stories of survival and remembrance. The memories of those lost lingered like shadows in the sunlight. One such story was that of Pierre, a young man who had joined the resistance after his village was burned down in reprisal. He lost his father and brother but lived to see the day Allied forces marched through the streets. "We were broken," he said quietly, "but not defeated. The war took much from us, but it couldn't take our spirit." Liberation also inspired acts of kindness and hope. Allied soldiers and French citizens worked side by side to clear rubble, distribute food, and tend to the wounded. Bonds formed between people who, until recently, had been strangers or enemies. The children of Normandy, many of whom had never known peace, began to dream of a future without fear. Schools reopened, laughter returned to the streets, and music once again filled the air. Yet, even as the towns celebrated, the war pressed on elsewhere. The victory in Normandy was a crucial step toward the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany, but battles raged on. For many, liberation was a moment of respite, a brief pause before the final push. In the midst of this fragile hope, stories of personal sacrifice abounded. Marie, a nurse who tended to wounded soldiers and civilians alike, spoke of nights spent in cold basements, stitching wounds by candlelight. Every life saved was a victory, she said, and every death was a reminder of what we fought for. The French also faced the challenge of rebuilding their identity. Years of occupation had shaken their national pride, but the spirit of resistance and liberation rekindled a sense of purpose. The memory of collaboration was a painful stain, but so too was the story of courage and resilience. In many ways, the liberation was not just the end of occupation, it was the birth of modern France, a nation scarred, yes, but determined to rise again. Yet, shadows lingered. Some collaborators fled, others hid. The fear of retribution and the desire for vengeance sometimes overshadowed the hope for peace. The country was a mosaic of stories, some heroic, some tragic, some blurred in the fog of war. As Normandy's towns lit bonfires to celebrate their freedom, the weight of the past bore down. The people knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but beneath the scars a new France was stirring, a France ready to reclaim its place in the world. The liberation was a symphony of triumph and tragedy, of justice and mercy, of hatred and forgiveness. It was a chapter where human emotions ran raw, where every street held a story, and every heart beat with the memory of sacrifice. And yet, amid the rubble and ruin, hope endured. The roar of artillery had faded, but the tension in the air was as thick as the smoke still rising from Paris's battered streets. It was August 19th, 1944. The City of Light, once shadowed by occupation and fear, stood trembling on the brink of liberation. But behind the celebrations and cheers, a question haunted everyone: who would rule after the Germans were driven out? For 5 years France had been fractured. The Vichy regime, a government born from surrender and compromise, had ruled in the name of France but under the iron thumb of Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, in London and beyond, General Charles de Gaulle had carved out a stubborn symbol of resistance. His Free French forces, though small, represented a vision of a free, proud France, unyielding and unbowed. Now, as the Allies pushed deeper into French soil and Paris prepared to throw off its chains, the eyes of the world turned toward de Gaulle. Would he finally return to the city that was his home? Would he reclaim the leadership of a nation desperate for hope and order, or would chaos and political rivalry tear France apart once liberation was secured? The answer would come with thunderous impact. To behind the scenes, tension simmered. De Gaulle was no stranger to opposition. His fierce nationalism and refusal to cooperate with other Allied governments made him a controversial figure. The British and Americans admired his courage, but often doubted his political savvy. Many French citizens viewed him with mixed feelings, some as a hero, others as a stubborn outsider. As Paris's streets burst into celebration on August 25th, the German commander, General Dietrich von Choltitz, made a fateful decision, ordered to destroy the city rather than let it fall into Allied hands. He hesitated. In a moment that would define history, von Choltitz refused to execute Hitler's scorched earth command, sparing Paris from devastation. For the Parisians, it was a miracle. Yet for de Gaulle, the liberation was also a delicate balancing act. He knew that entering Paris first was not just a matter of honor, it was essential for the future of France. If the Americans or the British led the procession, his claim to leadership might be weakened, his vision for France undermined. De Gaulle was a man shaped by history's cruelties and France's failures. A soldier in World War I, a leader of the Free French during the dark days of occupation, he carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. His return to Paris was not just a homecoming, it was a declaration France would govern itself again on its own terms. On August 25th, General de Gaulle entered Paris amid cheers and waving flags. His image was everywhere, the tall figure in a military uniform, his steely gaze fixed forward, embodying the pride and resilience of a wounded nation. Parisians crowded the streets, some weeping, others shouting his name. Yet, beneath the jubilation was a simmering tension. The city was still raw from the war, divided by memories of occupation, collaboration, and resistance. De Gaulle's speech at the Hôtel de Ville was both triumphant and sober. He spoke of the need to rebuild, to heal, and to unite. Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated, liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies, with the help and support of the Allied armies. His voice rang out, echoing across the square. But even as he spoke, there were challenges ahead. The provisional government he led had to assert control over a country torn by years of division. The resistance fighters, now heroes, were restless, demanding recognition and power. The communist-led factions pushed for radical change. The wounds of collaboration were raw, and many sought justice or vengeance. The Allies, while victorious, watched carefully. They had their own plans for post-war Europe and were wary of de Gaulle's ambition. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to explode. The fragile peace could shatter if the competing visions for France clashed too fiercely. In Paris's shadowed alleys and grand boulevards, stories unfolded of ordinary citizens who had endured the occupation and who now wrestled with what liberation truly meant. Jane, a nurse who had secretly aided the resistance, described the complex emotions. We were free, but freedom felt heavy. So many had suffered, so many were lost. The future was uncertain. We were proud, but afraid. Meanwhile, the political intrigues churned. The question of legitimacy haunted every decision. The Vichy regime was discredited, but its legacy lingered. The Communist Party, growing stronger by the day, pushed for a new order. De Gaulle, determined to preserve the Republic and prevent any drift toward chaos or extremism, worked tirelessly to unify the disparate factions. His leadership style was commanding but divisive. The Allies admired his determination, but worried about his authoritarian streak. French citizens were divided. Some embraced his vision of a strong, independent France. Others resented his refusal to compromise. As Paris healed from the war, de Gaulle set about rebuilding the nation's institutions. He re-established the Republic's authority, dissolved the puppet government, and called for new elections. The road was difficult. Economic hardship, social unrest, and political rivalry threatened stability. Yet through it all, de Gaulle stood as the unyielding symbol of French resilience. His vision extended beyond France's borders. He sought to restore the nation's place on the world stage, to rebuild alliances, but on French terms. His refusal to simply accept Allied dictate was both admired and feared. Behind the public speeches and parades, de Gaulle navigated a treacherous political landscape. The Allies pressed for cooperation, the resistance demanded justice, and the citizens struggled with the scars of occupation and collaboration. In one tense moment, he famously told a delegation of Allied officials, France is no longer a defeated country. It is a liberated country. We will rebuild, but France will decide its own future. The return of de Gaulle was a turning point, not just in military terms, but in the soul of a nation. Paris watched from afar and up close. The city that had endured occupation and war now saw a leader who embodied both its pain and its hope. Yet, questions remained. Could de Gaulle unify a fractured France? Could the wounds of war heal in time? And would the political battles ahead threaten to undo the sacrifices of those who had fought for freedom? The liberation of Paris was a victory, but it was also a beginning. As the crowds dispersed from the city squares and the flags were slowly lowered for the night, a shadow lingered. The war was not fully over. The struggle for France's soul had only just begun, and somewhere in the corridors of power, decisions were being made that would shape not only France's future, but the fate of Europe itself. The story of de Gaulle's return is not just one of triumph, but of resilience, complexity, and the raw challenges of rebuilding a nation scarred by war. The chapter closes on a city awakening, on a leader standing firm, and on a people hoping for peace but wary of the battles still to come. The sky burned red. Explosions ripped through the silence. In a single moment, entire villages vanished beneath clouds of smoke and dust. The once peaceful fields of Normandy were torn apart, not just by tanks and bullets, but by the unbearable cost borne by the innocent, the civilians caught between two armies locked in deadly conflict. This is the untold story of Normandy's people, mothers clutching their children, farmers hiding in cellars, entire families shattered by bombs meant to free them, but that also destroyed their homes, their lives, their very world. The Battle of Normandy is often told through the lens of strategy, bravery, and heroism. The tanks, the airborne drops, the beaches bristling with soldiers. But beneath this grand theatre of war, a quieter, darker struggle raged: survival. For over 75 days, from June to August 1944, the people of Normandy endured a relentless nightmare. The skies were filled with Allied planes dropping bombs to break the German defences, but each explosion risked shattering fragile homes. Streets that once echoed with laughter now lay silent, broken by the thunder of artillery. Fields once golden with harvest became battlefields, slick with blood and mud. Imagine Jeanne, a young woman from a small village near Cannes. She remembers the day the bombs fell close. We heard the planes first, like angry birds above us. Then the sky opened, the ground shook. I held my little brother tight, whispering that we'd be safe, but the house cracked, and we ran into the dark cellar. We could hear the screams, the crashing, the earth swallowing our world. Jan's story is not unique. Tens of thousands of civilians, many just children, faced the terrifying choice of fleeing or hiding, often with nowhere truly safe. The bombing campaigns, though essential for the Allied advance, came with tragic consequences. To understand why, we must look at the nature of the battle itself. Normandy's landscape was a patchwork of villages, farmland, and narrow lanes lined with thick hedgerows, natural barriers that offered cover for the German defenders, but also trapped civilians in the crossfire. The Allies faced a brutal dilemma: to break through the well-fortified German lines. Heavy bombing was necessary to destroy enemy positions, supply routes, and communication lines. But the bombs fell indiscriminately, scattering destruction across both military targets and civilian homes. These weren't just collateral damage in a distant war, they were lives, futures, and histories being erased. Take the city of Kellen, one of Normandy's largest urban centres. It was a vital objective, its capture crucial for the Allied advance. But the German defence was fierce. turning Kellen into a fortress. In response, the Allies unleashed massive bombing raids. By the end of July, over 2,000 Allied bombers had dropped thousands of tons of explosives on the city. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Streets became rubble-strewn mazes. Civilians who had survived years under occupation now faced the terror of liberation by fire. Pierre, an elderly man who lived in Caen at the time, recalls the destruction vividly. Our home was gone before we knew it. The sky was black with smoke. Neighbors disappeared. Some never found again. We lived in the ruins, searching for water, food, anything to survive. Liberation was supposed to be freedom, but it felt like the end of the world. Beyond Caen, smaller villages, like Saint-Leu and Caentain, experienced similar fates. Saint-Leu became known as the heart of the battle, and later the capital of ruins. Over 80% of the town was destroyed. The human cost was staggering. Estimates suggest that at least 15,000 civilians died in Normandy during the battle. Many more were wounded or displaced, their lives uprooted without warning. But amid the destruction, stories of courage and compassion flickered. Local residents formed makeshift hospitals in basements and barns, risking their lives to care for the wounded, soldiers and civilians alike. Children organized themselves into small groups to help the elderly escape danger. And the resistance, those brave few who had fought in the shadows, continued to assist in evacuations, sabotage and gathering intelligence, even as their own homes were shattered. Imagine Marie, a school teacher from Bayeux, who led a group of children through bombed-out streets to a safer village. They were frightened, their eyes wide with horror. I told them stories of hope, that we would see the sun again. Sometimes hope was the only shield we had. Yet the trauma was deep and lasting. The scars left on Normandy's landscape were mirrored in the hearts of its people. Families were torn apart, entire generations lost or forever changed. To understand the civilian experience fully, we must also recognize the psychological toll, the constant fear of bombardment, the loss of loved ones, the scarcity of food and clean water. It was a war fought not only with guns but with anguish. Children who had once played freely in open fields suddenly learned to crouch at the sound of an airplane. Adults struggled with grief and guilt, haunted by the question, why were they spared when so many others perished? Despite this, the spirit of Normandy's civilians was unbroken. They rebuilt their homes with whatever materials they could find, cleared the streets of rubble by hand, and nurtured the fragile hope of peace. Yet the battle was not just fought by soldiers on the front lines. It was waged daily by those who remained, enduring the chaos of war as best they could. There is a poignant moment captured in a letter from a young boy named Jacques, written to his mother just days before liberation. The night is filled with noises, explosions, shouts, footsteps. I am afraid, but I promise to be brave. When the soldiers come, we will be free. Until then, hold my hand in your dreams. Jacques' letter was never delivered. He was lost in the fighting that followed. His words, however, survive as a testament to the innocents caught in the crossfire. The Allies knew the price civilians paid was unbearable. Plans were made to provide relief, food, medical aid, shelter, but in the chaos of battle, help often came too late. Roads were blocked, towns were inaccessible. The war had uprooted not just armies, but the very fabric of daily life. After the fighting ceased, the process of recovery began. But recovery was a slow, painful journey. Normandy's people faced the challenge of reclaiming their land from destruction and rebuilding their shattered communities. Reconstruction was not just about bricks and mortar, it was about the healing of trauma, the reconciliation of neighbors who had lived under occupation and feared reprisals, the restoration of trust in a country torn by division. The civilian cost of Normandy's battle is a stark reminder that war's price is never paid by soldiers alone. It is etched into the homes, the hearts, and the histories of the innocent. And as the Allies pushed forward into the rest of France, these stories echoed a quiet plea that the price of freedom be remembered, honored, and never forgotten. The chapter closes on a field outside a small village where wildflowers now bloom over the scars of bomb craters. A child runs freely, their laughter carrying on the breeze, a fragile, beautiful promise that life endures even after the darkest storms. But the shadows remain. The cost of liberation was immense, and the wounds it left behind would take generations to heal. The fields lie silent now, yet beneath the green grass and gentle hills, thousands of stories sleep, stories of valor, sacrifice, and a price paid in blood. The ghosts of Normandy whisper through the memorials, the cemeteries, and the weathered stone that marks a history no one must forget. The D-Day landings and the Battle of Normandy left a scar that time has neither erased nor dulled. Nearly 80 years later, these landscapes still breathe with the echoes of that fateful summer of 1944. But the ghosts of Normandy are not shadows or spectres. They are the rows of white crosses stretching to the horizon at Omaha Beach's American Cemetery. They are the granite statues in the British and Canadian cemeteries, standing watch over the fallen. They are the quiet villages rebuilt, the shattered churches restored, and the towns that bear the scars of war like silent witnesses. Imagine stepping onto the cliff overlooking Omaha Beach. Below, the endless expanse of sand where so many brave souls charged into fire and chaos. Here lies the Normandy American Cemetery, the resting place of over 9,000 soldiers. Each cross and star of David tells a story, some known, many lost to time. Among them lies the famous unknown soldier, a symbol of all those whose names were never found, who never came home. Their sacrifice is etched in marble and memory, a reminder that war's cost often reaches beyond the numbers, beyond the history books. Walk a few miles east to the British Normandy Memorial near Vers-sur-Mer. Here, nearly 22,000 names are inscribed, men and women from the United Kingdom who gave their lives in the campaign, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians alike. These memorials serve as hallowed ground, places where families, veterans, and visitors come to reflect, to grieve, to remember. Yet, the landscape around them is far from peaceful. Fields once alive with battles still hold relics, shards of metal, rusted helmets, lost dog tags, silent witnesses hidden beneath layers of earth. In small villages like Sainte-Mère-Église, the echoes of war are more vivid than in any monument. The church spire still bears the parachute of Paratrooper John Steele, caught during the Airborne assault. His silhouette has become a symbol of courage and survival, a frozen moment in the chaos of battle. Local museums keep the artifacts alive. Letters, uniforms, weapons, all fragments of human lives interrupted by conflict. These remnants bridge the past and the present, making history tangible. Yet the ghosts are not only in stone and steel, they linger in the stories passed from generation to generation. Old men recount the thunderous roar of engines, the crackle of gunfire, and the cries of their comrades. Women speak of ration lines, air raid shelters, and the terrifying wait for news. Children learn of sacrifice through school lessons, family tales, and pilgrimages to these hallowed grounds. They hear the names of soldiers who fought for their freedom, names once foreign but now woven into the fabric of their identity. The battlefields have become classrooms, memorials, and reminders, a living history carved into the earth. But beneath this reverence lies a deeper question: what remains when the last veterans pass? When living memory fades, how do we keep the ghosts of Normandy alive? The answer lies in preservation and education. Groups across Normandy work tirelessly to maintain the cemeteries, clean the memorials, and protect the artifacts. They organize ceremonies, guided tours, and school visits to ensure that history is not forgotten. Technology adds a new layer. Virtual reality experiences recreate the landings, allowing people across the world to step into the shoes of those who fought. Digital archives collect testimonies, photographs, and documents, preserving voices that might otherwise be lost. Yet, for all the care and dedication, there are challenges. The ravages of time and weather threaten these sacred sites. Urban development and tourism can risk diluting their solemnity. The need to balance remembrance with living communities is a delicate dance. In towns once reduced to rubble, life pulses anew. Cafes buzz with conversation, markets fill with fresh produce, and children play in the streets where soldiers once marched. These living places hold a dual identity, sites of memory and places of daily life. This coexistence reflects the complex legacy of Normandy's battle. It was a crucible that forged freedom, but at an immense cost. The ghosts remind us that behind every strategy, every victory, there were human beings, sons, daughters, friends, and neighbors. Take the story of Mikkel, a local farmer whose family farm was used as a field hospital during the battle. He recalls his grandfather's words, "The land remembers, every shell crater, every scar on the trees tells a story. We must listen." Normandy's ghosts demand listening, reflection, and humility. They are a bridge between the past and the future, urging us to remember what was lost so that peace might endure. As the sun sets over the quiet beaches, the shadows lengthen, the wind carries a faint echo, the marching of soldiers, the whispered prayers, the silent tears. These are not ghosts of fear, but guardians of memory. Their stories live on, etched in stone and in the heart, and as long as they do, the sacrifices of Normandy will never be forgotten. The sea churned violently beneath a grey, pre-dawn sky. Explosions cracked the horizon, and men fell silently into the water. That single morning, D-Day, was not just the opening of a battle, it was the shattering of an old world and the birth of a new one. For nearly 6 weeks, Normandy was the crucible where history was forged. The beaches bled, the fields rotted under fire, and the sky rained metal and smoke. But from that fury came the transformation of armies, of nations, and of the world itself. D-Day remained the heart of it all. Over 100,000 Allied troops poured onto the beaches, fighting to carve a foothold under fire. Behind them lay months of preparation, secret plans, coded messages, and resistance fighters in the shadows. Ahead lay a continent gripped by war. By early August, the Allied breakout had begun. The hedgerows were shattered, the Falaise pocket was closed, and the German retreat was triggered. Europe's liberation had started in Normandy's mud and blood. From Corentin to Cherbourg, from Cherbourg to Caen, the tides of war had turned. But what made these 6 weeks the pivot of history? What changed? And why does Normandy still echo through time? The answer lies in the scale, the symbolism, and the ripple effects. First, the scale. It was the largest sea invasion in history. Ships numbered in the thousands, airmen poured from bombers overhead, and paratroopers dropped into the darkness behind enemy lines. Supplies and reinforcements flowed through makeshift pipelines, floating harbors, and secret pipelines beneath the water. The logistical effort itself was a marvel. Tanks, ammo, and food poured ashore in waves. Normandy became a staging ground for the greatest army the world had known, now pressing eastward at full force. Second, the symbolism. Losing Normandy meant losing everything. It showed Hitler's European fortress cracking. Enormous resources and elite divisions had been poured into the Atlantic Wall. Breaking through it destroyed German will and exposed the Reich's flank. For occupied countries, Normandy's beaches symbolized hope. French resistance fighters risked their lives nightly, waiting for that moment when the world came back. Their hope turned to liberation. Third, the ripple effect. The campaign altered post-war politics, borders and alliances. Out of France's ruins came a new world order. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, and a Cold War would form from the struggle just beyond Normandy's fields. France would rise again, rebuilt from liberation's ashes. The United Nations would be founded in the belief that never again should aggression go unchecked. But at the human level, Normandy changed lives forever. Soldiers who landed in June walked through war zones into victory if they survived. Paratroopers, like those of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, moved silently through God's own darkness, taking villages while children slept. Tank crews lost their breath in the roar of battle, yet held their ground. Engineers patched harbors under enemy fire, and resistance fighters gathered intelligence, sabotaged lines, and guided the liberation. Civilians hid, fled, or endured the bombs. Every one of them lived a moment that shaped them forever. Private Charles Reynolds, who stormed Omaha Beach, wrote, "My eyes still carry the image of that first wave hitting the sand. We charged into hell, but the sight of our flag on the cliffs made everything worth it." In Normandy's cemeteries, the crosses outnumber the graves because many men were never found. Their memory rests in marble walls, lists of names, and silent rows across sweeping lawns. Their families carry their stories and letters, souvenirs and heartbreak. When the fighting ended, peace was not instant. Reconstruction, purging collaborators, and healing old wounds took years. But Normandy stood firm as a beacon of resurgence. Pure limestone churches were rebuilt, crops were renewed in the battered fields, and schools reopened. Allied soldiers helped build schools and hospitals. They planted trees as memorials. Life returned in cycles, harvest after harvest, over the scars of war. Normandy's legacy stretched far. Veterans gathered every year on the stormy beaches to walk the sand again. Pilgrims traveled from all over the world to the cemeteries, to the museum in Sainte-Mère-Église, to the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc. They fell silent at the memorials under grey skies, tears glistening over the names carved in stone. Because Normandy is not just history, it is a living tribute. In the years after D-Day, nations formed alliances that reshaped Europe. NATO grew from the fear of another war. Europe looked to Union, Germany and France reconciled, and walls fell in Berlin. The freedom that came ashore in Normandy's water became a beacon through the centuries. And yet, part of Normandy's legacy is the question what would have happened without it. If Hitler had held the line, if the beaches had flooded with blood and failure, the world might have slipped into a prolonged darkness. Occupied Europe might never have seen salvation, and the Cold War map might have been drawn differently. Instead, 6 weeks in Normandy became the hinge of fate, a gamble paid in sacrifice, a turning point anchored not just in strategy and command, but in blood, courage, and human will. Normandy changed war. It changed memory. It changed how we remember bravery, how we honor loss, and how we shape peace. But perhaps most importantly, Normandy changed us. When children read about those beaches in school, when grandchildren visit the cemeteries, when veterans tell their stories, their voices trembling, we inherit that legacy, not as passive observers, but as guardians. Because the promise made in that stormy dawn must outlive memory. The world remembers Normandy not to glorify war, but to honor those who fought so it might never happen again. So, as the screen fades to black, remember this 6 weeks of noise, fear and sacrifice remade the world. And in that remaking, amid the dirt of the hedgerows and the roar of tanks, humanity prevailed.